Chapter 150. Amandina looked at the back of the limping youth and Yura's calm figure. She could not help but ask, "You're letting them go just like that, my lord? What else can I do? The less trouble the better." Brando answered simply, "But I feel like you're plotting something." Amandina glanced at him suspiciously. Brando could not help but smile bitterly and touch the tip of his nose. "I'm not that bad in your eyes, am I? I remember that I've always done things in an open and above-board manner." "Yes, but I think that my lord's actions are never as simple as they seem on the surface, isn't it? You arranged for Miss Freya to go to the Royal Cavalry Academy in Brags. On the surface it seems like you're supporting each other, but in private, I think you're paying attention to the conflict between the royal faction and the local nobles. Am I right? If I remember correctly, the Royal Cavalry Academy is in the private territory of the eldest princess. Among the descendants of His Majesty, rumor has it that the eldest princess is the most outstanding. Moreover, I heard that the eldest princess and the only heir to the throne, the cowardly little prince, have always acted as a guardian and sister. That's how it is. After His Majesty, it's not impossible for the eldest princess to seize power and become the regent. In this way, Sir Overlord's actions will become an invisible investment." Roman heard the word investment and quickly nodded. In other words, these hidden investments may not have any effect at first. But once you have your own lord, you will naturally become a member of the faction that supports the eldest princess. Of course, I wouldn't think so much if it were a normal person. But from my lord's actions, perhaps others don't know. But those close to you know that your ambition is not as simple as just a little bit. Amandina raised her head. "Isn't that right, my lord?" The girl finished speaking in one breath and let out a sigh. In fact, she was just pouring out the guesses she had over the past few days. She could not understand Brando's actions recently, and she did not want to fall too far behind her lord. Especially as the chief of staff. Brando blinked and said, "Something like that." However, he knew that this young lady from a noble family had not guessed everything correctly. In particular, it was an investment, but it was more like a connection. In fact, he did not need the title of righteous. He just needed to bury his head in farming. After all, the players were different from the lords in this world. Moreover, he still had the territory under his control. As long as he waited for the civil strife to reach its fiercest stage, he could take the opportunity to expand. When Madara began to invade Erewhon, and when Her Royal Highness could no longer control the situation, he could wait until then to step out and seize the greatest benefits. But he did not do so. His feelings for the game made him send the future Valkyrie to the princess side. He believed that the two most outstanding women in Erewhon's history would not disappoint him. That way, even if his prediction was wrong, at least he wouldn't have any regrets. However, he did not expect Amandina to understand his intentions in such a way. He could not help but smile, but he did not say anything. To be able to guess to this extent already showed the young lady's intelligence. He looked back at the Roman, and the young lady looked back at him as if it was fun. However, she did not look surprised at all. She did not even need to understand why Brando did this. She would only do her best to help him. This was the biggest difference between the Roman and Amandina. Brando thought that sometimes, being too clear-headed might not necessarily lead to happiness. Thus, he looked at the Roman, and saw the latter's expression that was always natural. It was also a kind of pleasure. "Then next," Amandina replied, "participate in the auction to raise funds, and sponsor the Roman to participate in the celebration after the war." On the surface, the transfer of funds under the surface is actually a deep infiltration of a region. This is also the first time I found out that gold is a good thing. With its omnipresent power, the Romans' tentacles are like moisturizing things silently, and the originally intricate lower-class citizens controlled by the nobles and thieves' guilds. We don't even need to deliberately manage and maintain it, and we can hear voices from all sides. During Bragg's operation, I originally wanted to communicate with the Thieves' Guild to obtain this information, but I didn't think that I had already fallen into a disadvantage in your eyes. She raised her head and asked. "This is also one of the original intentions of establishing a merchant guild." Brando nodded honestly. "But it is not the power of money, but the power of interests. People will unconsciously categorize themselves into a certain system, even if it is only for selfish purposes, but often the things they do will benefit others, just like the circulation of goods. This is a wonderful phenomenon. Gathering information is actually not that difficult. My aunt said that rumors are always everywhere. The Romans seemed to be very interested in this topic and answered. That is because we do not have high requirements for the quality of information. The most difficult part of processing information is not the collection, but the screening of useful information. This requires a large number of professionals. Brando smiled. That's a different story. But that is why I suspect that my lord has other motives. Isn't it a very normal guess? My lord, you never do things that do not benefit you. Amandina's eyelashes fluttered slightly as she stared at him. These two things don't mean anything, it is just a coincidence. Brando did not want to be entangled with this intelligent girl on this topic. After all, he had too many secrets, and a lie often required more lies to cover it up. The more you speak, the more likely you will be exposed. Then the matter of the Red Copper Dragon mercenary group retreating behind the scenes on the surface, it was to keep a low profile. But it was later proven that it was to arrange for Freya to enter the Royal Cavalry Academy. My lord, you seem to have always known about the few places for the Royal Cavalry Academy. The girl blinked and her suspicions deepened. No, it is not just that. My lord, you seem to be able to see further than normal people. While we are still struggling with the benefits in front of us, you seem to have already seen the final result. I don't know if this is a talent, but it really puts a lot of pressure on me. She sighed and could not help but complain. All right. Brando hurriedly waved his hand. I understand. Let's just take it that way. You are right, this is a talent. But after all, a person's considerations are not always comprehensive. He raised his head and looked. Battles under the night sky were always inseparable from fire. The fire had already started to burn from the direction of the camp, and the sky in the north was faintly glowing, gradually changing into a layer of magnificent light red. As the battle gradually reached its climax, the direction they were in also became unsafe. After all, it was only a temporary shelter. It seems like I have said too much off topic. Let's hurry and leave this place before we are affected by the battle. Brando looked around and changed the topic. After he finished speaking, he did not give the girl a chance to ask further, and had already grabbed his longsword that was chipped in the previous battle and fled. To be honest, Amandina's sharpness was far beyond his imagination. He was really worried that if she continued to ask, she would even copy out his identity card number. Only the heavens knew why he had such foresight in this world. Could it be that he was a transmigrator? And not just any transmigrator? Obviously, Brando would not make such a low-level mistake. Of course, his crude method of changing the topic did not escape Amandina's eyes, but she seemed to have realized that she had said too much. If it were not for the fact that she had more and more questions in the past few days, she would not have felt so uncomfortable. But she also understood that there was a limit to everything, and it was natural for a superior to hide certain things from his followers. Moreover, Brando's foresight had always been the source of her confidence in this small group. Thinking of this, she obediently followed him. But when it came to this, she could not help but turn back and ask in a low voice. Mr. Nightsong Tiger, is it all right if we leave from the east? She remembered that when Brando was speaking, the white-haired youth called Rady was obviously hiding something from them. Although almost everyone's attention was on Brando at that time, the cautious young lady did not miss this detail. The Nightsong Tiger looked at her with a smile full of admiration. Of course. He replied as if it was not enough. He patted his left arm like a real Lopez Mountain man and assured her, Miss Amandina, I have never seen a young man who is as familiar with these damned bastards as my lord. I'm not being modest, we have always dealt with them. The disciples of the Black Flames have always liked to create a diversion. But it is not easy to see through their arrangements. The experienced mercenary looked at Brando's back and praised. Even if it's me, I can only judge from the direction of their attack that their ambush should be from the south to the west. But compared to my lord, I'm still lacking. The Nightsong Tiger replied as he pointed at Brando's back with his chin. Do you see my lord's hand? I bet he took less than a minute to deal with that high-level contract demon, maybe within 10 swords. Only a veteran would understand that the fastest way to approach the Lord of Thorns is to attack it. Although this clumsy creature has a wide attack range, it will not be a threat once you get close to it. Amandina didn't really understand, but she could clearly see the old mercenary's admiration for Brando. She did not understand at first, but when she saw that the young knight did not seem to care about the wounds on his hands and back, she seemed to understand something. As far as she knew, there were very few descendants of Erewhon's nobles who could endure hardships like their ancestors. Brave and wise, decisive and tenacious. Was there such a lord? She really wanted to see what kind of achievements he would have. Amandina couldn't help but take a deep breath. P.S. I've appeared once again. I'm in a very good state today. Everyone can see that I've worked so hard. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 151. The battle seemed to have ended as soon as it started. Eek was almost certain that the people under the black robes were at least silver magi. He had expected this to happen, but he did not expect the result. He was almost certain that Cabot and the others would die on the spot, and he could not help but draw his sword to stop them. However, the white-haired old man who walked out from behind Cabot just casually pointed his finger, and a few gray rays flashed. The people who were his nightmares turned into a pile of dust. The young man's jaw dropped. He did not know if he was dreaming or not. When the old man cast a spell, the holy earth rune appeared on his palm. Even if Eek was ignorant, he knew that there were no more than 10 people in Erewhon. Among these 10 people, they were either high-ranked magi who had been famous for a long time, or they were lords. The only ones left were the leaders of the Black Tower Council and the Star and Moon Council. Who was he? Then he saw Cabot bow and respectfully say to the old man, "Master Fleetwood, thank you for your hard work." This sentence was like a bolt from the blue, making Eek unable to move forward or backward for a moment, unable to move forward or retreat from the back of the sack. In Erewhon there were many people with the name Fleetwood. However, there was only one person who was qualified to be called a master. Fleetwood? Hadwilla? Gemmer? The chief court magus of Erewhon, an elder who had assisted Anson VII for 3 generations. Eek's mind was in a mess. He could not understand why he would meet such an important person in such a remote place. It seemed that he was here to help them. This. The young man pointed at the old man. You are. The old man nodded and admitted his guess. He then replied, "It's a long story, Mr. Eek. Let Knight Cabot bring us to a safe place. I'll explain it to you later." Cabot. Knight? Eek looked at Cabot and felt that the world had been turned upside down. Brando and the others walked along the quiet mountain forest to the east. The rustling footsteps of the team of 15 shuffled through the thick grass like an invisible snake slithering through the darkness. When they looked back, they could see the sparks of fire in the forest at the foot of the mountain. There used to be a brightly lit campsite there, but now there were only scattered embers of charcoal in the darkness. "Our horses are still in the camp, Brando." This was already the 3rd time she had asked this question. Brando knew that the Roman's heart ached for her little pony, so he couldn't help but shake his head with a smile. "They will retreat, won't they, Brando?" The merchant lady's eyes sparkled with the light from the fire below the mountain. She turned her head and lifted her chin as she asked. She knew what Brando meant. But the Roman was still a soft-hearted girl. Even though she knew that she and her aunt were not welcomed by the villagers, the land where they grew up was still considered their homeland. That was why she was willing to help Freya rebuild Bucci. "Only Lady Martha knows about this," Brando answered. Whether or not the Grey Wolves mercenaries would follow in the footsteps of history was not up to him. Instead, it was up to him whether or not he could influence Makarov's opinion. But they know that this is a trap, so they should be more vigilant. The Roman asked, "Brando, didn't you say that Makarov is a smart man?" "He is too smart." Brando knew that before Makarov became a mercenary, this maned wolf was known as the Cunning Fox. He was once the brains of the royal faction's reformist faction. If not for the political failure 11 years ago, he would not have fallen to this state. "So they are plotting against each other?" Amandina asked. "More or less. I really don't understand why they are doing this." Amandina could not help but raise another hypothesis. Could it be that there is a secret in this forest that is tempting enough? Brando smiled. There was a secret, but it was not tempting enough. Moreover, the 2 sides of the conflict did not care about this point. They were concerned about something else. Amandina saw his smile and immediately asked, "Do you know something, my lord?" Brando nodded. "Do you remember the young man we saw a few days ago?" He said. "His real name should be Eek? Lantanilin? Ophelia?" "That name sounds familiar." "Naturally, then you should have heard of Canon? Lantanilin? Ophelia?" The Roman and the other mercenaries were fine, but Amandina could not help but choke and cough violently. After a long time, she looked up with a pale face and asked while gasping, "Duke Anthony? Eek also has a title, Count Maywack. This is a title with a territory." Brando narrowed his eyes. "It's just that I'm afraid even he doesn't know. This is..." Amandina could not help but ask, "Is it related to the political struggle 11 years ago? Oh right, didn't Duke Anthony's son disappear a long time ago?" She suddenly stopped talking and looked at Brando with a strange expression. "My lord, how do you know so much?" "It's an open secret," Brando said without thinking. "So this is..." "It's still an open secret. Erewhon is no longer the Erewhon of the past. Its upper echelons are so old that it's not worth repairing. It's even worse, it's beyond cure." Brando looked at the noble girl and deliberately said these words in front of her. "We are not the only ones who have noticed this. Look, Miss Amandina. In less than 3 months this country will be torn apart. What you're seeing now is just its final struggle." Although these words were not considered treacherous in this world, the ambition contained in them was still obvious. "Can the Corvado dynasty still be saved?" Amandina asked. She was still thinking of the name that brought glory to Erewhon. "Maybe there are more." Brendel thought of the regent princess. "What should we do, my lord?" Amandina interrupted his thoughts and asked in a low voice, "Let's find the sage slate first." Brando looked at the rolling mountains in the distance. The mountains intersected with each other, forming different layers of black silhouettes in the dark night. But the young man's gaze seemed to be able to see through these obstacles, as if he had already seen the goal, and answered concisely and powerfully. The young man led the group to the top of the mountain, and the wind suddenly became stronger. It was as if the air from the southern mountain pass had whistled through the forest and lifted his cloak. Brando sniffed the wind and stared at the dark and quiet valley on the other side of the mountain. A trace of surprise flashed in his eyes, but it quickly turned into understanding. "It's here. It seems that these people are not joking with me when it comes to key issues." When the others heard this exclamation, they all turned to look at him. "Do you see the valley below? Is there a problem?" the Roman asked curiously. Brando stretched out a hand from under his cloak and pointed at the valley. But when they looked in the direction he pointed, all they saw was a layer of black carpet that was spread out along the mountain walls on both sides of the forest. But the young man turned his head, and a layer of light flashed in his eyes. "Have you heard of altars?" "Altars? Altars?" the Roman answered seriously. "When I was young, I saw the altar in the Temple of Flames with my aunt. Is it like that?" "Of course not." "Then you should have heard of the nest, right?" Everyone was silent. This was natural. There should be a nest in that valley. "What?" The mercenary captain standing behind him was shocked. Everyone knew that nests were the war potential of a country. But very few people knew that except for man-made nests, wild nests were dangerous forbidden zones. In fact, humans often had to pay a great price to purify a nest. "What level is the nest?" he asked immediately. "Don't be nervous." Brando signaled him to be quiet. He looked at the entire valley and paused for a moment. "That is an altar of order. If I'm not wrong, it is the Temple of Truth." "An altar of order? Have you heard of the Gate of Heaven?" The mercenaries sucked in a breath of cold air. The mercenaries of Lopez came from the kingdom of knights, Gareth, and naturally understood what this term meant. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the confused faces of Amandina and the Roman, and explained in a low voice, "The Angel of Thrones." Amandina gasped and looked at Brando in disbelief. The Kingdom of Knights was less than a fifth of Erewhon's land, but its strength was the strongest among the kingdoms of the Holy Church. This was because it had 2 of the strongest legions in Wonde, the fanatical Heart Knight Legion and the Radiant Royal Legion. In the last Holy War, Erewhon, as a subordinate of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, had suffered many losses at the hands of these 2 legions. The Nightsong Tiger looked at him in disbelief and stuttered, My lord, are you saying that there is a gate of heaven in this valley? Brando immediately shook his head. What a joke. There was no way he would be able to discover a gate of heaven in this valley. The gate of heaven was also known as the angel's staircase, and the creatures that were born from it were known as the strongest creatures of the Holy Church, the Angel of Thrones. Moreover, as long as there was a gate to heaven, there would be abnormal signs in the sky within 100 miles. With such obvious signs, unless the local holy cathedral of fire was extremely retarded, there was no way he would be able to get a share of the pie. No, there is an altar of order below that is similar to the gate of heaven. Brando replied. Similar. The mercenary leader was stunned. Although he was the embodiment of the most legendary mercenary in history, he was not a knowledgeable scholar. The nests of all the creatures in this world were in the hands of those in power or local aristocrats. Most people had only heard rumors about them, but most people had neither the qualifications nor the opportunity to understand them. You're saying that this is a nest under the protection of Lady Martha? Amandina keenly grasped Brando's meaning. Brando was taken aback. Even though he had the idea in his mind, he could not help but use the words in the game when he spoke. It could only be said that Sophie's personality always held the initiative when it came to quests and storylines. He smiled bitterly and nodded his head. If that's the case, then it's also a great discovery. The Nightsong Tiger immediately said. Because wild nests were too difficult to purify, transforming a nest that was contaminated with magic was not something that could be done in a day. The entire process could take up to 10 or 20 years. However, nests under the protection of Martha were different. They were gifts from God to the world, and the creatures of order that were born from them were natural allies of intelligent beings. Often, the owner of the nest only needed to pay for the daily expenses and a small reward, and the owner of the nest could obtain a powerful army from the altar of order. Therefore, in any kingdom, as long as they reported any altar of order to the Holy Cathedral of Fire, they would be able to obtain a rich territory that was close to 3 or 4 knight dominions. And it was a hereditary territory. Amandina, who was always calm, became excited when she thought of this. She looked at Brando. But Brando waved his hand. You're thinking too much. That's just an abandoned altar. Abandoned? Amandina was stunned, but she quickly asked, How do you know, my lord? Brando did not answer. He already knew that there was an altar of order in this direction, but he did not know the specific location. With his experience, if he could not confirm this point at this distance, then he would have lived in vain. He had once joined the Kingdom of Knights Grace as a player. Even before he came to this world, he was still a player. Therefore, he was all too familiar with the sacred and tranquil aura that permeated a certain range around the altar of order. What's more, a light screen had popped up in his vision earlier, indicating that he had entered the range of the sanctuary. As for why he knew that it was abandoned, wasn't it written in the guide? The group went down the valley. The side of the slope that they slid down seemed to have blocked out all the sounds from the other side. The valley was silent, and even the most common sound of insects in the summer could not be heard. Walking in the dark forest under the starlight, there were no obvious paths in the forest between the valleys. The group walked in the rugged, mossy forest, looking left and right, occasionally seeing flashes of light in the darkness. Those were the eyes of fireflies or just the eyes of animals. It was not the first time that Amandina and Roman traveled at night, so although they were nervous, they were not too afraid. The mercenaries of Lopez were even more calm. If the legendary mercenaries who had braved through fire and water were afraid of the dark, it would be too funny. But the environment here was indeed a little strange. I wasn't the one who discovered this altar. With the help of the dim starlight, Brendel saw some man-made rock fragments gradually appearing on the ground of the moss-covered forest where the roots intertwined with each other. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 152. Scarlet. A clear voice called out from the forest, accompanied by hurried footsteps. It sounded like a group of people was approaching them. The girl with light red long hair pressed a hand on the back of her head and turned around. Her thick eyelashes brushed, and her nearly translucent wine-like eyes reflected a ball of fire not far away. Sparks danced in the air, and her gloomy eyes flickered. She seemed a little confused. From the sound of it, it seems like Celia and the others. Didn't they go to look for Yura and Reedy? Why are they back? Did they find them, or did they run into some trouble? The girl called Scarlet vigilantly raised the halberd in her hand, or rather, the halberd. If Brando was here, he would definitely be able to recognize the halberd. Apart from the foot-long pitch-black blade, the spindle-shaped blade was one of the most eye-catching features of the weapon. The sharp edge of the blade spread out along the golden edge, making it look exceptionally beautiful. However, beautiful things were always dangerous. This halberd was known as Lightning Lance Logos, and was one of the most famous drops in the Chablis region. It was a must-have weapon for spear mercenaries. Even though it was only a level 25 halberd, its price had always been high on a few famous trading websites. There was no other reason other than the 1% chance that the user of this halberd would receive the Lightning Whisper special effect when attacking. The effect originated from the Elementalist spell of the same name. It would grant the user 10% lightning damage, which was equivalent to increasing the user's elemental damage by 10%. That was why the spear mercenaries had a tactic. They would first use the lightning lance to activate its effect, then use it with the mercenaries' instant battle preparation skill to instantly switch to their main weapon, asterisk. They would then use the wind elemental sensing potion, attribute strengthening crystal and other consumable items to deal damage. Asterisk. The difference between a mercenary and a warrior was that a warrior focused on technique, while a mercenary focused on battle. The latter viewed their weapons as tools. This was the so-called elemental damage type. However, it was rumored that the Lightning Lance Logos was owned by a spirit knight in the northern forest of Chablis. How did it end up in the girl's hands was an unsolved mystery. If Brando saw it now, he would probably be surprised as well. The first Lightning Lance Logos appeared in the year of the Swift, 377. Before the year of the Summer Leaves and Flowers, 375. The forest to the north of Chablis was still occupied by lizardmen bandits, wasn't it? Scarlet raised her head and saw a few people rushing out of the forest. She frowned. To the girl, the Grey Wolves mercenaries had a different meaning. She was an orphan who was adopted by Cabot, and this mercenary group was more like a huge family to her. Every time she fought, it was not for money, but to protect her family. However, other than fighting, she felt that she didn't know what else to do. There was only battle. However, for the past 11 years, the Grey Wolves mercenaries had been winning again and again. Everyone's confidence grew day by day, and gradually, it became a sense of honor. But this pride was met with a painful blow tonight. Scarlet did not understand where these enemies came from, but there was no doubt that they were extremely difficult to deal with, and their fighting spirit was terrifyingly tenacious. She had a bad premonition in her heart. Nervousness and exhaustion made her young heart pound in her chest. What's wrong? Scarlet, Yura has been found. The young girl let out a low sigh, and her eyes flashed. She put down her halberd and swung her long hair. Then she pressed her hand against her hair and asked, "So? What did the leaders say? Should we continue forward or retreat?" The crowd snickered. Everyone in the mercenary group knew that the red-haired girl had a good impression of Eek, but the few people involved were kept in the dark. It was a pity that this secret admiration could only be buried in the bottom of their hearts. Since Yura was Eek's fiancée, her relationship with that woman was not necessarily good. But Yura is Xingjian and she's smart. I think the leader would like her more. Scarlet pretended not to care and snorted lightly. Then she raised her head and glared at them. "Be careful, your mouths might rot," she said fiercely. But the laughter grew louder. Someone said amidst the kind laughter, "Scarlet, the leader has decided to advance to the northeast. You, Reedy, and Roller, the three captains, will each lead a group to pave the way. We'll go with you, okay?" Scarlet suddenly grinned. "Why do you want to go with me? You have ulterior motives, don't you?" "Why would we?" The few who were seen through quickly waved their hands. She raised her head and glared at one of the youths, who quickly lowered his head. "Idiot." Scarlet snorted inwardly. "Up to you." She turned around and answered. The youths looked at the girl's back blankly for a moment. They did not understand the girl's worries. The strength of paper cards far exceeded their expectations. But why didn't Captain Makarov give the order to retreat? Why did he insist on carrying out the original plan? Was it because he had a card up his sleeve, or was it because of some other reason? Scarlet pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beating rapidly. But since the leader had given the order, she had no grounds to disobey. She could only rely on the halberd in her hand. She tightened her grip on the halberd. It was a gift Eek bought from a merchant for her 15th birthday. She had long since made up her mind to fight with this halberd until the very end, even if it meant losing her life. Sometimes she even felt that this was the meaning of her life. But after walking for a while, she thought of something else. She tilted her head and asked, "I remember that the merchant was camping here. Why don't I see him?" "Maybe they got separated," the youths hesitantly answered as they followed her. After all, they were not the maned wolf Makarov's trusted subordinates. In fact, not everyone in the Grey Wolves mercenary group knew of his identity. Most of them thought that they were only in a temporary alliance on the surface. Scarlet frowned. "Then let's search in this direction. Is that all right?" "Why not? The Grey Wolves mercenaries can't be called a traitor," Scarlet replied. The youths behind her laughed again. She was obviously soft-hearted, but she had to find a dignified excuse. They were willing to follow her mostly because they wanted to see her make a fool out of herself. Of course, it was mostly out of goodwill. But just as Scarlet finished her words, another strange laughter came from the forest. The laughter sounded like the squeaking of the scarecrows that the mercenaries had seen in the manor of the nobles in the flatlands east of Ranner. It was hollow, dull, and filled with a sense of terror. Scarlet's expression changed as she looked up. She immediately saw the person wearing a black robe with red edges standing on top of a tree. On the other side of this person, there was a huge green beast entrenched on top of a black pine tree. The monster had the head of a goat, and a pair of fleshy wings drooped down, revealing spiked black metal chains wrapped around its wings. When did it come? Scarlet was shocked and frowned. Even though she did not know what it was, she knew that it was a tough opponent. "Little girl." The disciple wearing the black robe laughed and said with a sharp voice, "You said someone got separated from here. It has nothing to do with you." Scarlet raised her axe and gritted her teeth. In this ambush, the Grey Wolves mercenaries lost a team of sentries, and one of them was her sister who had a good relationship with her. Even though mercenaries were used to life and death, it did not mean that she could live peacefully with the enemy who caused it. Life and death were the mercenaries' choices. But an enemy was an enemy, and she could not live under the same sky. "It doesn't matter. It seems that one of my comrades died in the hands of those people. I'll vent my anger on you first." The disciple laughed strangely and said, "Abichils." With a clang, a pitch-black iron chain swept through the air towards the young girl. Scarlet grunted and sent the chain flying with her spear. However, the strength of the response from her arm made her secretly surprised. It was only one blow, but it had already made her entire right arm faintly numb. However, her performance was also out of the expectations of the disciple. Silver rank. Makarov's subordinates are indeed filled with hidden dragons and crouching tigers. I didn't expect a little girl like you to have such strength. There are many things that you can't imagine. Logo's lightning arrow. Scarlet clenched her teeth and thrust her spear at the disciple. A bolt of lightning flashed and drew a long arc along the edge of the spear. With a crackling sound, the arc of lightning crossed the distance of dozens of meters and leaped towards the disciple of the black flames. However, before the electric arc could reach the black-robed man, it was blocked by an invisible shield. Electric sparks flew in all directions, and the bark of the pine tree beside the disciple was immediately scorched black. However, the disciple himself did not move at all. Even the corner of his robe was not blown by the wind. A grade 2 magic weapon. How rare. The disciple clicked his tongue after a while. Scarlet's heart had turned cold. She took a deep breath and felt that her limbs were cold. But after a moment of fear, she felt anger rising from the bottom of her heart. She turned around and saw her companions pulling out their weapons and preparing to join the battle. She could not help but yell, "Run! What are you all doing?" "Scarlet." "Leader, you?" The youths were stunned. "Run. I'm not his match. Ask the leader to bring people to save me." "That's a good plan." The disciple grunted and raised his hand. The monster in front of him immediately shot out another chain. This time the target was the youths. Damn it! Scarlet gritted her teeth and threw her spear at the chain. With a loud bang, the chain and the spear bounced off in opposite directions. Scarlet immediately raised her hand and a streak of lightning flashed between her and the spear. In the next moment, the spear flew back to her hand. It was as if the spear and the weapon were connected. Elemental resonance. The disciples screamed. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 153. That's what he said? Even though the Grey Wolves mercenaries were ambushed by the disciples of the Black Flames and the enemy mercenaries, they had no choice but to abandon their camp and retreat to the south. However, Maned Wolf Makarov didn't panic in the face of danger. He calmly commanded the retreat and even gathered his men along the way to form a new fighting force. With that alone, he could be considered a famous general in this era. In the forest, as usual, he was with Buga, wearing a fiery red military uniform. It was the uniform of the royal guard during the time of the previous king. Since Makarov was the captain of the royal guard, this uniform had been his symbol ever since. But after he left the army due to persecution, the uniform no longer had any epaulets, belts, or emblems. He pressed down on his own sword, the Type 35 cavalry sword, which was used by commanders. This type of sword was the most popular weapon for level 30 to 40 swordsmen in the game. Of course, it wasn't because it was very strong, but it was because it had a high price to performance ratio. This kind of sword could be said to have the best attributes among the magic longswords that were around level 30 and below brass. There were a lot of them circulating in the market, which was why it was so popular. However, Makarov didn't seem to be worried about the enemy's attack. Instead, he raised his eyebrows and his expression was calm. Only when he heard Yura's words did he raise his eyebrows and ask. Seeing Yura nod, Makarov turned to Buga and asked, Xiangdong, it seems like that young man Brando has a card up his sleeve. Should we follow them? Wait. Rady hurriedly interrupted him. Even though this white-haired young man was a mercenary, he had more freedom than the others. Normal people wouldn't dare to interrupt like this. Leader, our opponent is the tree herders. Shouldn't we retreat first and think of a better plan? I think they must have come prepared since they are making such a big fuss. If we continue to fight them here, wouldn't we be playing into their hands? His words were hurried and rushed, but Makarov and Buga were used to this young man's personality and didn't think much of it. However, Rady immediately thought of something and asked, Oh right, Eek is still in town. Will he be safe? Makarov looked at the young man and nodded. You are right, Rady. But no one can guarantee that the Grey Wolves mercenaries will be safe once they retreat to Chablis. He saw Yura lowering her head and knew that she was worried about her lover. He sighed and said, In fact, the vice leader and I already knew that Conrad wasn't as simple as he seemed. But since we dared to lure him here, we should be prepared. I don't know what he discovered, but it's good for him to stay. Cabot is there to protect him. Don't worry. Buga remained silent as he listened by the side, but the tall swordsman was startled for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head towards the direction of the forest. Immediately, a blinding flash of light appeared, followed by a deafening roar from behind the forest. Everyone's expression changed. Just as Rady was about to say something, one of the mercenaries exclaimed, The seventh cord. Scarlet is in trouble. Buga unsheathed the greatsword on his back, but he immediately let go of it and stared at the direction with a solemn expression. The battle is over. Scarlet, Yura's face paled. I'll go save her. Rady seemed to have only just realized what was going on. He immediately drew his sword and tried to rush in that direction. But Makarov grabbed him by the shoulder and stopped him from moving. Stop. Leader? Makarov didn't say a word and frowned for the first time. He looked towards the direction of the forest with a serious expression. Not long after, shadows appeared in the forest. Screams of pain could be heard from afar. It sounded like the cries of humans or beasts. The mercenaries who were at the edge of the forest quickly retreated. This was because a large number of disciples of the Black Flame sect had suddenly appeared in the forest in the southwest. As they moved forward, the heavy chains on their feet and hands rubbed against the ground and swept through the bushes, creating a clanking sound. At this moment the quiet forest was particularly eerie. The north is just a feint. The enemy is lying in ambush in the south. At this moment this clear thought flashed through everyone's mind. Unfortunately, it was a little too late to react. Scarlet and Rowell had obviously been defeated, but the mercenaries didn't have the time to grieve for the loss of their comrades. They were in the same danger. These were all experienced warriors, and they could tell at a glance that the enemy outnumbered them by at least 3-1. Rady gulped. Even though he wasn't afraid of death, he still felt suffocated in the face of such a situation. Even though Yura couldn't see, she knew how dangerous the situation was. "Conrad." Buga spoke in a low but powerful voice. "Oh." A frivolous voice immediately responded from the forest. It sounded like a young man. "Mr. Buga, you know me. But should I call you Buga the Cross? Or should I call you Duke Anthony or Grand Duke Lone's personal guard?" The members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but be startled. They turned around and looked at their vice leader in astonishment. Although they didn't believe him, it was hard for them to suppress their curiosity. Buga and Makarov were unfazed. Makarov raised his hand to stop Buga and said, "I didn't expect the Paper Cards mercenaries to be working together with the infamous tree herders. It won't be good if word gets out." The forest immediately fell silent. There were many who knew about the disciples of the Black Flames, but not many knew about their relationship with the tree herders. The young man called Conrad didn't expect Makarov to know so much. He paused for a moment and mocked, as expected of the cunning fox of the past. "You know quite a lot." As expected. Makarov furrowed his brows. He was trying to confirm Brendel's words. However, he wasn't worried that it would affect their morale. Mercenaries were different from regular soldiers. They were a group of fugitives and didn't care about life and death as much as normal people. That was why in Wonde, even though the strength, equipment, and discipline of the mercenaries couldn't compare to regular soldiers, they were still a powerful force. "All right, Mr. Makarov." Conrad smiled and said, "Actually, I'm here to confirm with you whether the only son of Grand Duke Lone is with you now." The Grey Wolves mercenaries were stunned again. They couldn't help but look at their leader. Why was there another duke? That was an unreachable figure in their eyes. Makarov laughed. "What a joke. I don't even know what you're talking about. And even if I do you think I have the obligation to answer your questions as enemies?" He couldn't help but mock. But the young man in the forest shook his head. "You can't say that. Do you have the heart to see so many of your old subordinates who have followed you for more than 10 years die here?" But he immediately nodded. "That's right. They are nothing compared to your original identity. For your mission, it's only right to abandon these cannon fodders." Buga snorted. "All right, Conrad. We are all mercenaries. Do you think your words will affect us mercenaries?" Makarov shook his head. "Why don't you give it a try and see if you have any skills? For our profession, the worst-case scenario is death." "It's nothing." Maned Wolf's words caused the mercenaries to chuckle. It was because of this that people like them had already accepted life and death. To them, it was extremely laughable for someone like Conrad to be so hesitant and try to persuade them for half a day before the battle. Mercenaries had their own code of conduct. Their loyalty to a group was completely different from that of regular soldiers. Therefore, the other party's attempt to sow discord was laughable in their eyes. As if to express their thoughts, the mercenaries drew their swords and prepared for battle. The sound of metal clashing could be heard in the forest. On the other side, in the dark forest that blocked out the starlight. "That damned old man." The young man called Conrad cursed. He glanced at the injured red-haired girl beside him and snorted. "That old fox Makarov isn't easy to deal with. Too bad our target isn't him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered to waste my breath on him. Since we know he won't say anything, why don't we just kill him?" A man covered in a black robe beside the young man said in a low voice. When he raised his hand, 2 red lines could be seen on his sleeves. If Brando saw this, he would probably run away immediately. This was a low-ranked priest of the disciples of the Black Flames. Compared to the high-ranked disciples, he was much stronger. We could have. But the Grey Wolves mercenaries still have 2 groups that we don't know where they are. We can't let our guard down. That bastard Makarov is known for his cunning. The young man said with a gloomy face. He knocked on a tree trunk beside him. That bastard left a group of people in Chablis. There's also that young man called Eek. It seems like he's putting on an act, but no matter how I think about it, it's just a shell to divert our attention. Who knows? The disciple of the Black Flames replied. Don't worry. I left a gold-rank swordsman there just to be safe. Even though that Capote hid his strength, his true strength is only SOSO. Then what are you worried about, Mr. Emissary? Conrad snorted in disdain. He crouched down and grabbed the girl's long red hair and pulled her head up. Fresh blood immediately flowed from the girl's forehead down her cheeks. Scarlet groaned in pain. She squinted her eyes, which were covered with scabs, as if she wanted to see who was in front of her. But when the young man exerted force, she immediately curled up in pain. Ugh! The young man laughed sinisterly. Of course it's the other group that went missing from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Even though that group of 12 mercenaries, a young merchant and 2 women joined the Grey Wolves mercenaries midway, it's impossible for me to believe such a lie. Makarov must have made arrangements. But I can't pry open his mouth, and he can't guarantee that everyone in the mercenary group will be as stubborn as him. Is that so? He looked at the dying girl and asked, Little girl. Scarlet seemed to have just realized the situation she was in. She gritted her teeth and turned her head to the side. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 154. What? Not going to say? Conrad chuckled. He took out a dagger and patted the girl's face. Since the people who left are not your companions, why are you risking your life to protect them? The cold blade of the dagger reflected a soul-stirring light, as if it was a layer of ice that emitted traces of coldness. As if she could feel the coldness of the blade, the girl moved slightly. But she took a light breath and replied in a low voice, one word at a time. Not being able to defeat you is my own responsibility. My own matter. I alone am responsible. Only the weak will rely on putting others in danger to protect themselves. I'm different from you. Her half-opened eyes seemed to be burning with flames as she answered. Is that so? Conrad was not angry. But I don't have much patience. You have to know that there are 70 to 80 people in the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Not everyone is willing to keep their mouth shut for strangers like you. They are mercenaries. I remember that mercenaries don't have to be so loyal. Since that's the case, the final result will not change. Why are you so stubborn? I don't take pleasure in killing people. That's why I'm giving you a chance. Little girl, you don't want to go to your weak Lady Martha and cry, right? Scarlet's eyelashes moved. The young man waited for her answer. But the girl only clenched her teeth and shook her head. Others are others. I am myself. That was her answer. Then we can only meet again, little girl. Scarlet tensed up at that moment. Her face turned pale. She was only an ordinary person. Even if she was a mercenary who was used to seeing life and death, she would still feel fear at the last moment. But this fear did not defeat her determination. She clenched her teeth and did not speak. Her hands were clenched into fists as if she had accepted her fate. 2 streams of tears flowed down from the corners of her tightly shut eyes. Conrad turned around. The dark bishop from the Black Fire sect who had been standing behind him nodded his head. It was just as Conrad had said. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were already in their hands. As for the captive, there was no need to care about this one. Moreover, according to the definition of a mercenary, although these desperados were willing to risk their lives in battle, they would not easily give up their lives for some meaningless perseverance. Makarov and Buga had to keep it a secret, but the others didn't. The 2 of them knew this very well. The young man picked up the dagger and stabbed towards the girl's chest. The dark divine priest of the Black Fire sect looked at this scene coldly, as if the blood that bloomed like a flower did not represent the passing of a life, but was merely a beautiful painting that was worth admiring. He heard a cracking sound coming from the red-haired girl's throat. Scarlet seemed to be trying her best to grab onto something at the last moment, but she suddenly opened her eyes. Her gaze gradually became empty and then lost its light. Her consciousness and strength were rapidly leaving her body, but at the last moment, she couldn't help but wonder if that person knew that she was already dead. It turned out that life was so fragile. She suddenly felt extremely sleepy, But at the same time, she felt someone put something on her chest. What is that? What is that? Conrad turned around and saw the dark divine priest of the Black Fire sect in a black robe place a dark red gem that emitted a faint light in the middle of the girl's chest. A few rays of light that resembled the roots of a plant extended from the gem, and the black light seeped into the wound below the dagger. The light then spread along the girl's blood vessels to her limbs, and soon, a layer of faint red mist covered the entire body. Blood of God, Lord Emissary. The dark divine priest answered simply. You want to awaken her into a spirit figurine? No. The dark divine priest shook his head. This woman was able to resonate with her weapon, and had the ability to defeat our high-ranked disciple with the strength of a lower silver rank. This means that she has great potential. This potential comes from the fact that she already has such accomplishments at such a young age. The dark divine priest spoke with a hoarse voice under the cloak. I gave her the blood of thunder god Kabai. If she can awaken an emissary, then this gamble will be worth it. High-ranked divine blood? Conrad couldn't help but squint his eyes. How did you get it? A low-ranked dark divine priest like you shouldn't be qualified to receive such an item, right? It's just a coincidence. Luck is also important. Chaos is the law. The dark divine priest replied. The young man snorted lightly and looked down at Scarlet's body. The dark red light had already wrapped around her body into a cocoon of light. The failure rate is also high. He said. Then what we lose is just a high-quality corpse. The dark divine priest replied coldly. Suit yourself. I'm going to attack now. You better stand further away. Buga and Makarov aren't ordinary people. If they fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid I'll lose half of my life. Conrad turned around and looked out of the forest. But even though he said that, his right hand, which was wearing a white glove, was still casually placed on the hilt of his rapier. The dark divine priest knew the importance of this mission. So he didn't refute and only lowered his head. He paused for a moment and looked up again. That group that left, is it really the real Eek? The probability is very high. Conrad walked out of the forest and answered without turning back. It doesn't matter anyway. No matter what, they won't be able to escape. If I want them to die, they will die. The dark divine priest sneered silently. In the quiet forest, the silence was quickly broken by a single sentence. So my lord already knew that Eek was the eldest son of Duke Anthony? Of course not, Miss Amandina. I only suspected it at first. Brando sighed and replied. But Miss Yura reminded me that she was Eek's fiancée. I've seen them once in the Black Tower, but I just didn't remember. Of course that wasn't the truth. Brando couldn't have seen them once in the Black Tower. But it didn't matter. He thought that no one would jump out to expose him anyway. And he wasn't completely lying. He really only remembered this matter after seeing Yura. Miss Yura wasn't a nameless person in history. She could be said to be the most famous astrologer in Erewhon. At the same time, her strength was also ridiculously strong. In the history of the Amber Sword, Brando clearly remembered that Yura was a chosen one, and her blindness from birth proved this point. The chosen one was a person who was favored by Martha, but mortals were mortals after all. Their flawed bodies couldn't accept such perfect power. Therefore, when the divine power was born, the body itself would be damaged. In the long history of Wound, there were only two chosen one who didn't have any physical defects. One was the hero of the Fire Kingdoms, one of the four saints, King of Flames Gretel. The other was born in this era, and now held the cold mercury staff of Madara, the future emperor. Although most of the other chosen ones were famous, they still had their flaws. But at this moment, Yura could become a martial arts master in the future. She could even reach level 150 at her peak after activating her elemental power. She had helped Duke Lone, the Valkyrie, and the Princess Regent to stand on equal footing. Such a fact would only be treated as a joke if it was told. Could it be that her talent as a chosen one was awakened in this battle? Such a thought suddenly flashed through Brando's mind. He wanted to win over this future first-class powerhouse, but it was a pity that Yura had already fallen in love with Eek. Although Duke Anthony was still biased towards the royal family at this time, it was only a matter of time before they broke up. Brando calculated the date and found that he had neither the ability nor the time to change this matter. But he wasn't too worried. After all, Eek and Yura had contributed to the unification of Erewhon in the end. It was a pity that these two geniuses died young, and Yura left behind a daughter in history. He remembered that after the death of the Princess Regent and the Valkyrie, the girl named Ilara Lantanilan Ophelia had once led Aween's last resistance army. But at that time, Brando had already left the front lines of the war with Madara and joined the Church of Night Nation Grace. Amandina listened to Brando's explanation, but still looked at him suspiciously. Is that so? The whole thing seems to be a fight between two mercenary groups, but it's actually a continuation of the war between the nobles. Maned Wolf Makarov is Duke Lone's retainer? The entire Grey Wolves mercenaries are the bodyguards of that young man called Eek? Then what does the Paper Cards mercenaries want to do? Is it just an assassination? No, most of the people in the Grey Wolves mercenaries don't know about it, Brando said. When Duke Arek was in control of the court, almost all of Duke Lone's family members were killed in an assassination. You should know about this, right? Of course, the blood of the nobles dyed the coup that took place in the month. How could I not know about it? Amandina's eyes flashed. In fact, Duke Lone already knew about the assassination, so he sent his only son out before it happened. That's why he planned to use the deaths of others to cover for his only son. Brando took a deep breath and answered calmly. Amandina didn't say a word after listening to him. The struggle between the nobles was always so bloody, and from a certain point of view, Duke Lone's actions were understandable. Roman looked at them from not far away, but she didn't seem to be interested in this topic. So they're using their only son to threaten Duke Lone? Amandina thought for a moment and raised her head to ask. That's a sharp reaction, Brando praised. Duke Lone is still the strongest supporter of the royal family. If someone wants to make a move, they'll have to first shake this pillar of the royal family. So, yeah? Amandina frowned worriedly. Even though the chaotic situation was an advantage for them, as a citizen of the kingdom, she didn't want to see the worst happen. Less than 3 months. Brando answered. Did he already know about this? Amandina raised her head and asked. She suddenly realized something. He purposely lured the disciples of the Black Flames here. He wants to use the mercenaries as bait? I'm afraid so. The girl took a deep breath. Those were more than 100 lives, and according to Brando, they were his old subordinates who had been following him for at least 10 years. Even though she knew that only cold-blooded people could survive in such a cruel battle, she still couldn't help but feel her hands and feet go cold when she really came into contact with it. She suddenly glanced at Brando and could not help but think, does my lord think the same? However, Brando's gaze was still fixed on the valley below. He knew that there was a problem waiting for him to solve there. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 155. Brendel's gaze fell silently on the quiet valley below, and did not disperse. While the tree shepherds were inevitably plotting against them, he was also looking for a way to break out of the situation. Maned Wolf Makarov had successfully deceived him, the tree herders, and even the players who participated in the plot. He had cleverly sent Duke Lone's only son out of danger. The cunning fox was a step ahead, but he was not easy to deal with after gathering enough information. He stopped and tapped his chin with his knuckles. He was confident that his wisdom came from the accumulation of experience from the previous players, and the wisdom of a group of people was always greater than that of a single person. The water was muddied, but the fish would not necessarily swim with the current. Makarov probably wouldn't have dreamt that there was an altar of order that had been abandoned for 200 years in this quiet northern forest. But just like what Brando said to Amandina, he was not the first to discover this altar. In the First Era, before the year of separation 100 years, Erewhon and the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had discovered this altar. But in less than a century, this altar had mysteriously disappeared from all records, as if it had never existed in the first place. But players were still players, and those who participated in the plot only used a little bit of clues to uncover the entire story from the dusty history. But they probably did not expect that the series of investigations they did out of interest would end up benefiting Brando. Amandina probably noticed that her lord was distracted, and followed his gaze to the dense forest canopy below. But she did not discover anything even after looking for a long time. She turned back to look at Brando, and noticed the seriousness on his face. She wisely did not speak again. She had guessed that if Makarov was willing to trap his own people, there was no reason why he would not drag them down with him. She snorted in her heart and subconsciously placed Duke Lone's faction in the list of unwelcome nobles. The group gradually descended into the valley. The two mercenaries of Lopez walked in front to clear the path. Their swords made a rustling sound as they chopped down on the branches. Occasionally, the surface of the swords reflected the starlight, and the bright light dazzled everyone's eyes. He paid 2 wealth points from his storage to maintain the mercenaries of Lopez card on the field. Then, he checked the resources that he could use, including the 10 points of water EP that he had saved up in the past few weeks, as well as nearly 150 points of wealth. That was enough. He raised his head and narrowed his eyes. The young man saw that his summoned creature had stopped. The two mercenaries looked at each other, unable to believe what they saw. They stopped and turned back to look at Brendel. "My lord, there's..." "What is it?" the Nightsong Tiger asked sternly. These two mercenaries were the most inexperienced in his team, and he had intended to train them, but he did not expect their performance to make him feel ashamed. As he spoke, he strode forward and parted the shrubs in front of him, as if to make up for the mistakes of his subordinates. But in the next moment he was stunned. Behind the dense forest was an open grassland. The grassland was at least the size of 3 football fields, and a temple covered with vines stood quietly in the middle of it. The Nightsong Tiger took a deep breath and raised his head. He could almost imagine how magnificent this majestic building was under the sun in the past, because even now, he could vaguely see the past glory of this temple through the dense foliage. Its structure was very simple. It was a cylindrical temple that rose up from the ground, and the arched roof shone with a white marble light under the moonlight. But its size made up for its simplicity. It was close to 60 feet tall, and it stood in the middle of the open space like the shadow of a giant. Brando stopped and looked at the exterior of the temple from the outside. From the style, there was no doubt that it belonged to the elven goddess. Unfortunately, the elven goddess had already turned into the stars in the sky according to her own will. What was left in this world was only their will and laws to change this world. The gods rarely interfered in the mortal world, and it was because of this that these noble existences were revered by the creatures on the ground. However, after losing the protection of the divine power, the temple inevitably lost its former glory. Brando saw that the southern part of the temple had collapsed, and he did not know how many years it had been since he last visited it. "Ah!" The merchant girl who came up from behind let out a small gasp. "This is..." Amandina was also stunned. "This is the Silver Elves' holy temple." Brando was used to seeing the magnificent and majestic buildings in the game. The elves, dwarves, and winged tribes were natural masters of architecture, and their cities were majestic and shocking. He was only dazed for a moment, and recovered from the shock of seeing this temple for the first time. This was originally the royal tomb of the Silver Elves, and even after that, the humans did not renovate this place. Unlike the Forest Elves, the humans had always treated the Silver Elves as their strongest ally. This relationship had been maintained ever since the defeat of the Dark Dragon in the War of the Holy Saints. The commoners still had this understanding of the Silver Elves, which was why they were so precious. The royal tomb? Amandina turned her head. How did the royal tomb become an altar? Because the Silver Elven kings made a solemn oath when they were alive, and were willing to use their eternal lives to protect their homeland. After the elven goddess Shay communicated with Lady Martha, their heroic spirits were allowed to stay here forever. "A nest of heroic spirits?" Amandina asked. Brando nodded. "How did it get abandoned?" "On the surface it was because of the war. In reality it was because the elven kings were unwilling to participate in the war between humans. Erwin's people almost angered Martha, and the truth of the matter was covered up." Brando looked back at Amandina and the Roman. "You will not find a single record of this in any of the kingdom's documents." The two girls nodded in unison. They did not ask how Brando knew this, and they knew that the answer would be the truth of the history recorded by the wizards. "There's still room for this altar to be reactivated." Brendel's words shocked everyone once again. What? Don't get too excited, it's just a possibility. But only he knew that if the guide did not lie, the possibility of reactivation was 100%. But because of the restrictions of the storyline quest, the creatures that were created could only exist for 30 days. But 30 days was more than enough for the quest. Amandina and the Nightsong Tiger were excited after hearing Brando's words. This was a nest of creatures, and even if it was only a possibility of reactivation, the benefits behind this possibility were too great. This information was like a shining treasure chest in front of everyone. It could be filled with gold, silver and jewels, or it could be empty. But in front of such a treasure chest, most people would not be able to remain calm. The Nightsong Tiger licked his lips and asked in a low voice, "What should we do, my lord?" Brando looked at them and pointed at the two mercenaries behind him. "You two are elementalists, right?" "Yes, my lord." The two mercenaries nodded in unison. "Do you have crossbowmen?" "Yes." The Nightsong Tiger immediately pointed at 4 people. "Is that enough?" "Yes," Brando said as he took out a coil of rope from his backpack. "4 of you, come with me. I'll arrange the battle strategy." Amandina frowned. "Is there going to be a battle?" "Don't worry, it's just a small ghost night." Brando saw the Nightsong Tiger's face turn green when he finished speaking. He was surprised and asked, "What's wrong?" "My lord, did you say a small ghost night?" The Nightsong Tiger asked with a strange expression. Brando coughed and remembered that the ghost night was not worth mentioning, but it was a true level 35 elite undead. Even the guide had stated that there had to be at least 20 level 20 warriors in order to deal with the ghost night. However, that guide was a product from before the Middle Ages of the game. By his time, the player's mindset had already changed. He had at least 9 out of 10 ways to deal with the ghost night. Brando comforted the Nightsong Tiger. "Don't worry too much, the ghost night has a fatal weakness. Just listen to my orders and it won't be difficult to deal with it." The Nightsong Tiger looked at his lord doubtfully. If it was a normal mercenary, he would have turned around and left already. Ghost knights were one of the scariest creatures in the legends of the wilderness. Rumor had it that they dashed through the forest like shadows under the moonlight, quietly taking away the lives of the living. Anyone below the level of a gold-tier swordsman was nothing but a piece of cake for them. Even if there were twice as many black iron-ranked mercenaries, they would still be slaughtered, not to mention the 12 of them. But this was also the reason why most people did not interact with these creatures. After all, they were not like players who could revive after death. They could use their lives to gain experience, and NPCs were naturally not as good as players in this aspect. But the Nightsong Tiger was still summoned by Brando, so he nodded. Amandina saw this and confirmed her suspicions about the Nightsong Tiger being a noble's retainer, but she did not point it out. Instead, she asked another question. "Isn't this the Elven King's tomb under Martha's protection? Why would an evil spirit appear here?" Brando snorted. In the past, the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wanted to protect this lair, and tried to forcefully change the oath of the undead. In the end, the power of chaos took advantage of this and corrupted the altar of order, causing the evil spirit to appear. Legend has it that Martha was enraged by this and indirectly caused the Cipher dynasty to change. Amandina nodded. She did not expect there to be such a legend. "My lord, are you talking about that?" At this time, the mercenary who had been monitoring the temple suddenly turned around and pointed in the direction of the temple. Brando turned around subconsciously. "P.S. I've been writing this chapter since yesterday and I've been in tears. I've finally gotten back to the dungeon. Half of the month has already passed, but the monthly votes are still far from half. I beg for everyone's support so that I can get a consolation prize. The pitiful person waiting for the money to go under the knife is on the verge of tears." Chapter 156. Under the moonlight, the rider looked like a translucent crystal statue, glowing under the fine dust. It held a silver spear in its hand and rode around the periphery of the temple. Then it disappeared from everyone's sight on the other side of the wall. The whole process was silent, but Brando was able to determine the general attributes of the ghost knight. It was a territorial monster. He immediately decided on his strategy. He turned around and saw 13 pairs of eyes with different colors. They were hesitant and nervous. The mercenaries, including the Nightsong Tiger, held their breaths as they waited for his command. Amandina covered her mouth with her hand and coughed twice. She then took a deep breath to calm herself down. But her brown eyes were bright like the stars in the sky. There was no fear or hesitation in her eyes. Her gaze was still on the direction of the temple. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He subconsciously paid more attention to the young lady to prevent her from sneaking out on a whim. To this egotistical fellow who called himself Lord Roman, this didn't seem to be something impossible. It was as if there was no danger in this world for her. There were times when Brendel could not help but wonder how his aunt, whom he had never met before, managed to raise Romain into such a character. A normal family would not have the ability to do so, but now was not the time to think about that. He turned around and said, "The strategy is actually very simple." He parted the shrubs and looked around. Then he raised his sword and pointed to the side of the hill. "See that Grinoire's black pine? You guys go there and ambush it. You just need to wait for me to lure it over." "That's it?" Everyone was stunned. "But what are we going to do, my lord?" The Nightsong Tiger asked doubtfully. Brendel glanced at him and thought to himself, "Do you still need people to teach you this? Since you've already entered the ambush, you don't have to be courteous." But this was the difference between the players and the natives. The players would not care about the consequences. They would just fight and think about it later. The worst that could happen was death. Therefore, he was startled for a moment, and then answered matter-of-factly, "This of course with all his might." However, he suddenly realized where the problem was, so he simply changed to a simpler way of explaining. "Alright, in other words, you can just take it that he has a grudge against you for stealing your wife and killing your son." "My wife and child?" The Nightsong Tiger paused for a moment and asked in confusion. "But my lord, to be honest, my wife died in the war with Cruz." Brando sighed and face-bombed. "Then you can treat it as if it owes your mercenary group 1,000,000 tor, and does not intend to pay." Shock. Since the mercenaries of Lopez became famous, they had never heard of anyone who dared to delay their payment. There was a saying that cutting off one's livelihood was equivalent to killing one's parents. If they did not take revenge, how could they live under the same sky? The eyes of the mercenaries of Lopez turned red in an instant. The Nightsong Tiger gripped his axe so tightly that it creaked. He shouted, "Martha above, so it's the same as the untrustworthy Anjou people. My lord, please do not worry. In the name of Lady Martha, we will beat the shit out of that undead who deserves to be cursed. We will teach it that it is not so easy to owe the Lopez people a debt." Amandina stood awkwardly at the side as she listened to the mercenaries' ramblings. As the daughter of a wealthy family in Brugloss, she did not have the chance to speak with such vulgar language. The profanities in his words almost made her faint, but she clenched her teeth and held on. She coughed and whispered with a red face, "Brando, the opponent is the legendary Ghost Knight. Can we really defeat it?" Amandina was not Brando's summoned creatures like these mercenaries. They could wholeheartedly trust him, but she still had doubts in her heart. Brando's plan was too simple. With such a simple method, wouldn't anyone be able to defeat the Ghost Knight? They were just a small group of ordinary mercenaries, and not all of them were sword masters, great wizards, sorcerers, or elven messengers. In the limited description of the Spectre Knight in the literature, the strength of the Spectre Knight was at least at the peak of the silver rank, close to the level of a gold rank knight. What were they going to use to fight against a quasi-gold tier swordsman? Was it just an ambush? However, the ambush would not increase their fixed combat strength. Or could it be that the purpose of hiding there was just to scare the enemy? Alright, even if this made sense, one had to consider that undead creatures wouldn't feel fear at all, right? Of course. Brando used a matter-of-fact answer to block her words. "Why?" Amandina could not help but ask. "Don't worry, it won't attack us. To be exact, it can't hit us." "It can't hit us?" Amandina was tongue-tied. What kind of reason was that? Why couldn't the Ghost Knight be hit? Was it handicapped? Or was it that the knight was actually a pacifist? For a moment, she could not help but feel a little angry. This was not a good time to joke, but she thought about Brando's glorious achievements. It seemed that even the most ridiculous things would become normal in front of him. But the most inconceivable thing was that every time it happened, it proved that he was right. Amandina suddenly felt that she should calm down. But she still could not control herself and complained in a small voice. I can't accept this kind of explanation. I'm your aide, my lord. Brando shrugged. It was really difficult for him to explain. Because there were very few monsters that would patrol along a fixed route, this meant that the Ghost Knight had a very strong sense of territory. But in the game, this type of monster had another name, and that was Lord Monsters. These monsters had a common characteristic, and that was that they would wander around their fixed area. Once they touched the boundary of their territory, no matter what happened at that time, they would immediately turn back. This type of monster was extremely rare in the game, and because of this mandatory setting, it was easy for players to exploit the loopholes in the rules to kill monsters that were much higher level than them. That was why most of the Lord monsters were abnormally fierce, and most of them were long-ranged creatures. For example, the sealed black dragon in the Kenora Canyon, the Seven Dragons King Fuchsia Kath, Hound God Ogleister's teacher, the evil dragon that was nicknamed Master Craftsman by the players. Even though its ceiling area was only 3 miles, its attack range was as far as 100 miles. It was one of the strongest monsters in the Northern Wound. The other type of monster was even more overpowered. It was a monster that could not be killed outside of its domain. For example, call the Earthly Spirit. But Brando also knew that there was a third type of Lord monsters. That was the quest boss that was limited by the storyline and the quest so that a more powerful monster could reasonably appear in a lower level area, so that players of the corresponding level could have a chance to kill it. Obviously, this Ghost Knight was the last type. Of course, when the players who completed this quest for the first time wrote the guide, the players at that time did not have a deep understanding of the Amber Sword, as they did later on, so they used a brute force approach in the guide. But in Brando's opinion, it was not that troublesome. But he was actually a little disappointed because even if he did, he would have a way to take down the Ghost Knight. But because the original setting was a plot kill, the equipment dropped by the monster would be reduced by 50%, and that was not just a little. Basically, it would completely reduce the portion of the overlevel reward, and even exceed it by a little. Brando did not know how this world was set up, but according to his original experience, it should not be far off. He lowered his head and looked at Amandina with his tea-brown eyes without blinking. In fact, he also knew the reason why the Ghost Knight could not be too far away from the temple. These evil spirits were born from the unyielding resistance of the ancient elven kings, but Martha sealed the altar before they had the time to rush out of their nest. In history, many of the Erewhon priests and monks died in that incident, so the royal family had been unwilling to mention this secret for many years. On the other hand, the sealed altar no longer provided magic, so the evil spirits naturally could not maintain it. It was just that this altar seemed to have a trace of life remaining, which prevented it from immediately disintegrating, but it could only hover around the temple. But it was simple to say, but to explain all of this involved the knowledge of the soul and the mana core. Brando was a player, so he could speak without restraint, but this knowledge was one of the core knowledge of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It involved the contract between humans and spirits, and was also the source of their power. He was not a highly accomplished theologian, and if he pretended to be a half-baked wizard with the identity of a Highland knight, it would be fine, but if he opened his mouth and said these things, even if Amandina was a puppet, she would suspect him. Moreover, the girl was so sharp. Maybe it's because I think that the Ghost Knight looks a little friendly. Maybe it won't attack us? He finally thought about it and answered with a straight face. Lord Brando. Amandina took a deep breath. All right, Brando patted her shoulder. Don't be nervous, learn from the little Roman. Don't worry, when have I ever lied? Learn from the little Roman? Amandina could not help but look back at Amandina, who was looking at the direction of the shrine absent-mindedly, as if she was looking forward to seeing the Ghost Knight again. I think it's often. Amandina sighed and muttered in dissatisfaction, but she also knew that Brando had never said anything wrong, as if he could predict the outcome of everything. Brando smiled, knowing that she was convinced. He waved his hand to signal the others to move, and then borrowed a heavy crossbow from the Nightsong Tiger. When it came to luring monsters, a heavy crossbow was a treasure among the players. But the Nightsong Tiger looked at his actions and frowned, and could not help but ask, My lord, do you want me to lure the undead over? No need, I'm an expert in this field. Brando patted the heavy crossbow confidently, and the string creaked as if he was going to shoot the arrow ahead of time. The Nightsong Tiger's heart trembled as he watched from the side. Why does this young lord look like a layman? If not, he would not have made such a rude request. After all, in Wonde, he would be suspected of looking down on his lord if he said such a thing. In this era where a noble's reputation was more important than their lives, this was a serious crime. But he couldn't just watch as his lord was sent to his death. Fortunately, Amandina could see the worry in the mercenary captain's eyes. She couldn't help but ask in a small voice, "My lord, is there any problem?" Brando looked at her strangely. "What's the problem?" Amandina choked on her words, but she did not immediately roll her eyes. But Brando smiled. "All right, I know what you're worried about. But if there's a ghost night crystal, I'll invite you to the most luxurious inn in Amperseal for once." Ghost Knight's crystal. The two of them were stunned. What's that? What does once mean? P.S. Thank you for everyone's support. Please continue to support us. Chapter 157. Brando smiled. Of course, you wouldn't understand the value of the Ghost Knight's crystal. This thing was once hyped up to 300 million tor in the Amber Sword. Until the middle of the Second Era, only a few warriors could afford to use equipment with the Ghost Knight's crystal engraved on it. However, it seemed like wishful thinking to want to get the engraved crystal. In other words, it was like the clouds floating in the sky. It looked beautiful, but it was meaningless. Because even Brando himself didn't take this sentence seriously. The engraved crystal was a product of the purification of a monster's own attributes. It could be dark, evil, flying, or floating. Any kind of engraved crystal only had a very small chance of being produced, not to mention the Ghost Knight's crystal. The drop rate was about 7 decimal places. The chance of getting this thing was only slightly higher than transmigrating to another world. He held up the heavy crossbow and asked, "Do you have any magic arrows?" "Yes." The two elementalists in the mercenaries of Lopez immediately answered. The two girls were twins. Their long gray-brown hair was tied into thin braids beside their long ears. They were actually wild elves from the mountains of Orgash. When Brando became a member of the Divine Force in his previous life, he fought against the undead for a long time in Orgash. He was not unfamiliar with this race. The wild elves were actually the children of the goddess Gaia, so they were closer to the dwarves of the stone race. The two races often had the tradition of intermarriage, and their customs were also very different. However, the wild elves valued martial arts. They were rich in hunters, elementalists, and hunters. These three professions were all offensive professions. It was obvious that their culture was fierce. When the fourth king of Cruz, Longblade Harson, invaded the Lopez Principality, he suffered a great loss at their hands. Although he won in the end, he paid a heavy price. To this day, the people of Cruz and the wild elves were still hostile to each other. It was because of this fierce and open culture that many wild elves came to the human world. The profession they chose was also very fierce: mercenaries. On this point, the Lopez mercenaries were the wild elves, mountain dwarves, and the Lopez mercenaries were the allied forces of the Lopez mercenaries. Therefore, Brando was not surprised to hear that there were 2 elementalists from the wild elves among the mercenaries. If there were 2 war priests, that would be the most shocking thing. The Lopez people and the Curlutz people were sworn enemies that never interacted with each other. The war priests were elite priests trained by the Cruz people. The organization's predecessor was the Imperial War Missionary Society. The headquarters is the Holy Temple of the King, located in the mountainous highlands of the Haralai region. Every year, the Holy Temple produces a steady stream of young and excellent priests for the Empire, whose emblem is the eagle. "My lord, which one do you belong to?" The older sister with a sharper face and fairer skin asked in a sweet voice. "Ice and wind, how many can you make?" "If I don't reserve my magic power, I can make 10. "I can make 6. The younger sister replied in a crisp voice. "That's enough," Brando interrupted them. "Give me 7 of each, and the remaining 2 will be guided arrows." The 2 sisters looked at each other with a strange expression. They looked at their captain. In the end, it was the older sister who asked softly, "My lord, we can understand the wind-binding arrow and ice-rending arrow, but guided arrow? Guided arrow isn't usually used alone?" They were not lying. Guided arrows were usually used to make expensive double, or even multiple magic arrows. After all, high-level magic arrows were expensive and could not be recycled. However, a magic arrow would only be effective if it hit the target. For example, if someone missed a dragon-slaying arrow, it would be a huge loss. Thus, the so-called double magic arrow was born, also known as guided magic arrows. But they had never heard of a single guided arrow being used alone. It was not like the nobles used it to cheat when hunting. But Brando had other plans. He smiled. It's fine, you just have to do it. There's no need to conserve your mana. After completing my mission, you can rest at the back with Roman and Amandina. The rest of the battle will be left to the others. The older sister nodded. Even though she still had doubts, she knew that human lords were often obstinate and opinionated. So the more mature elven girl wisely chose to keep her mouth shut. But her younger sister frowned and continued to ask, "But my lord, Tia," she shouted sternly. The younger sister looked at her sister in surprise. She understood her sister's meaning and kept her mouth shut. Brando was stunned. He could not help but think of the Shire. Sometimes it was hard to believe that these people with their own judgment, memories and emotions were life forms summoned from a card. If it was someone else, they would not be able to tell at all. But he smiled bitterly. Did he look like a cold and heartless lord? Even though he was a little stern in front of these mercenaries, it was only because of his personality. There was no need for such a big misunderstanding, right? He turned around and saw that Amandina was holding back her laughter. Roman was also looking at him with a smile, as if they were watching a good show. "I say, am I still your lord? Your attitude is not right." Brando complained in his heart, but he still forced a smile on his face. "Don't worry about it," he replied with a dry smile. 14 magic arrows were quickly handed to him. In fact, according to Brando's strength when he was at his peak, he estimated that at most half of the arrows would be enough. But now was not the same as before. He was not a level 130 warrior, so he prepared as many arrows as he could. In any case, 2 elementalists with 2 rings, lower level iron ranked, would not be of much help in the upcoming battle. He inserted the arrows one by one into the buckles of his belt, so that he could use them easily. Then he looked up and saw that the mercenaries in the forest were also in position. This made him feel a little more at ease. However, just as he relaxed a little, he became even more upset when he saw the face of the middle-aged man beside him, which was full of vicissitudes of life. "I said no problem. Captain Nightsong." Brando sighed. No matter how he explained, the Nightsong Tiger was still worried about him. His reason was simple. Just like the Shire, he knew the relationship between them and Brando, so he would not let him take the risk. "It's fine, my lord. Just let me stay. I can revive even if I die, so you can just treat it as a shield." The Nightsong Tiger replied calmly. "Why does this sound so familiar?" "Yes, I can revive, but I have to wait until tomorrow morning, and I have to pay an extra maintenance fee." "Lord Nightsong Tiger." Brando listened to the Nightsong Tiger's explanation with amusement. He looked back at the forest and confirmed that the Roman and Amandina were far away. Then he asked, "They're all gone. Are you the only one among the 12 mercenaries who understands this?" The Nightsong Tiger nodded and did not deny it. Every summoning card has a core, or a leader. Other than that, the others are called derivatives. In this card, I'm the core. The core setting can be said to be the Planeswalker's assistant, helping him manage the derivatives created by this card, or other cards or spells attached to this card. There's such a setting? Brendel paused for a moment before he thought of something else. If that's the case, then the knowledge that each core possesses is different. Of course, it's related to the card itself. The Nightsong Tiger replied. "Then what do you know? Do you know how to get a card from the graveyard?" He asked jokingly. "Black cards are mysterious and unpredictable. If my lord wants to use the graveyard tactic, I'm afraid you'll need to collect a dark elemental land card. This type of land card can be found in swamps, graveyards, or places where undead creatures gather." The Nightsong Tiger replied. Brendel nodded, took a deep breath and looked ahead. He raised his heavy crossbow. "Then you stay here. Just don't cause trouble for me." His gaze swept across the temple that stood alone under the cold moonlight. It had been 2 centuries since Erewhon's people left this place, and no other intelligent beings had entered this ruined temple. He calculated the time as he thought about these irrelevant things. In the past games, luring monsters was a skill, A true expert could make his opponent appear in a desired location along the path he had planned. For low-level AIs, he needed to remember the opponent's judgment. For high-level monsters, it was a battle of the hearts of the people. Brando did not neglect any of these things. Although he was not a hunter in the past, he did not have a complete team. As a warrior, this was one of his jobs. 8-7, Brando muttered softly. The mercenary captain obviously did not understand what he was calculating. After all, the way the NPCs fought was different from the way the players fought. For the players, no matter how real the world was, it was still a digital world. Everything was written using numbers. Brando was the same. Their thinking was beyond the game, and they were like a precise machine that recorded every change in the numbers. Everything followed a pattern. He calculated the time and pulled the trigger. The first arrow installed on the crossbow was a hollow whistling arrow. It immediately let out a sharp cry and flew out. The hollow arrow drew a white stream of air on both sides and drew an arc as it drilled into the shadow of the temple. 6-5. The sharp screech alerted the hostile undead, and the glowing knight appeared at the side of the temple. The Nightsong Tiger placed one hand on the handle of his flying axe and tensed up. But Brando immediately threw away the crossbow and took out his own short bow. He had bought this bow when the Highland Squire card entered the graveyard. Although it was not as good as the Shire's construct bow, it was better than nothing. Brando signaled to the Nightsong Tiger. Retreat now. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 158. The Spectre Knight had already noticed the commotion. It silently turned its horse around and pointed its spear at Brendel. The air in the dark was like a layer of ice that was wrapped in a layer of fog, forming a vacuum zone. Brando immediately pushed the Nightsong Tiger away and rolled to the other side. Asterisk bang. Asterisk bang. Asterisk 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 asterisk bang. The Spectre Knight let go of its spear, and a 10-foot wide path appeared in the middle of the forest. Brando and the Spectre were no longer obstructed. Spectre's spear. Fuck. Did it have to use its ultimate skill right from the start? Brando could not help but curse. He wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. He was thankful that he had seen the Spectre Knight raise its right hand and knew that something was wrong. The Spectre's spear had the ability to pierce through armor, and like his White Raven sword, it had the ability to increase its attack range. If they had not dodged in time, he and the Nightsong Tiger would have been left with two cold corpses. The Nightsong Tiger was also nervous. He had only heard of the Spectre Knight in legends, but now that he was facing it, he realized that it was much more difficult to deal with than he had imagined. The Nightsong Tiger could not help but spit on the ground. He was almost middle-aged, but he still had to fight like a child. The world was changing fast. He could not help but look at Brando, but he saw that the young man was unfazed by the Spectre Knight's attack. The Nightsong Tiger could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. We can't beat it. The Nightsong Tiger was an experienced veteran mercenary, and he could tell the difference between the enemy and himself in an instant. He then shouted at Brando from the other side, but Brando only signaled him to be quiet. He raised his short bow with both hands. The young man could now clearly see the terrifying Spectre's appearance. It looked like a classic knight from Wone's paintings. It was covered in a layer of Gothic armor, and its entire body was covered in a layer of hazy light. Even the warhorse it was riding was no exception. But it was not a horse, but a spectre. The knight's spear was like a long silver spear. It held the spear tightly in its hand, and the tip of the spear was pointed towards the ground. It was an illusion caused by the spectre's elemental essence. After coming into contact with the gold rank, be it warriors, mages, knights, or other professions, they all began to more or less display the power of elemental powers. The Nightsong Tiger crawled up from the ground and tried to stop Brendel's next move, trying to pull him back. In the eyes of this mercenary captain, his lord, or rather his summoner, was simply crazy. They were no match for that monster at all. The power displayed by the Spectre Knight had far exceeded his understanding of the ordinary low-level gold-level powerhouses. But Brando turned a deaf ear to his shouts. The young man knocked a silver arrow, took aim and released the arrow. The arrow flew over the Spectre Knight's head in a stunning arc and exploded behind it. However, the silver ice mist only brushed past the Spectre Knight's left shoulder and formed a layer of white frost. Brando could not help but blush. He coughed to cover up his embarrassment. He just remembered that he only had weapon mastery, and was no longer a level 40 archer. Even so, the Spectre Knight's movement was slowed down by the frost arrow. Although it was limited, the Spectre Knight's spear still missed its target, and a streak of silver light flew over their heads. The Nightsong Tiger turned around and saw the canopy of the trees behind him disappear, leaving behind only a bare tree trunk. He opened his mouth, unable to breathe. The mercenaries of Lopez were brave and good at fighting, but this battle was beyond his understanding. Was this guy a walking cannon? 3 seconds. Noticing that the Nightsong Tiger did not care about his archery, Brando breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, his fingers once again knocked the bowstring of his short bow. The spirit spear consumed a lot of soul fire, and the Spectre Knight would enter cooldown after using it twice in a row. This was not the first time he had fought against this kind of undead, so he was well aware of the situation and could calm down. Brando straightened his short bow and extended the aiming time. The Nightsong Tiger thought that this action was no different from courting death, but Brando was like a statue. He only had 3 seconds. The second frostburst arrow missed, and the third frostburst arrow hit the Spectre Knight's waist. After the silver ice powder exploded, half of the Spectre Knight's body was shrouded in a gray mist. Brando saw that he had dealt 13 points of damage to the Spectre Knight. The damage was negligible to the Spectre Knight, but the frost on its armor increased the delay of its attack by 12.5%. The effect of the frost arrow was the same as what he remembered. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Although the Spectre Knight was a spirit, its magic arrows were not physical attacks, so there was no penalty for losing them. It was a pity that the Elementalist Sisters' levels were too low, or else the Spectre's attack speed would be reduced by at least half. But it was enough. He still had 4 arrows in his hand. It's actually effective? The Nightsong Tiger's eyes were sharp. Although he could not see the data as clearly as Brando, he could still see the clues as soon as the Spectre Knight slowed down. Nonsense, Brendel said in annoyance. He knew that this bastard would only drag him down if he stayed. But even so, we are still not its opponent, my lord. So, let's retreat. Compared to this guy, I'd rather fight the disciples of the Black Flames. The Nightsong Tiger shouted. Brando ignored the Nightsong Tiger, and threw another bundle of green magic arrows to the Nightsong Tiger. The Nightsong Tiger caught it subconsciously and asked, "What are you doing?" "Nonsense, of course it's to help me. What are you doing here?" Although the Nightsong Tiger did not know what Brando meant, he could guess that Brando was dissatisfied with his previous performance. The Nightsong Tiger's face turned red, but he could not help but complain in his heart. He thought to himself, "Do you think everyone is the same as you, Sir Lord? To be able to face these terrifying, human-shaped cannons without batting an eyelid, I don't know if this is audacious or foolish." But even so, the Lopez mercenaries who had been mercenaries for generations still worshipped courageous and valiant warriors. As for his summoner, he didn't say it out loud, but in his heart, he was convinced of his strength. At this moment, Brando had already fired his 4th frost arrow in 3 seconds. This one hit the Spectre Knight's right shoulder and caused a thick layer of ice to form on its armor. The efficiency of the Spectre Knights had been reduced by more than 30%. Most people would have been happy to beat the Spectre Knights when they were down, but the young man did not say a word. He just dragged his mercenary leader and ran away. As soon as he left, the Spectre Knight and its mount turned around and sped up. This was not a normal pursuit, but a common skill used by knights and warriors: charge. Brando also activated charge. The man and the undead were like a black line and a silver line chasing each other in the forest. Although it was only for a moment, the scene was so beautiful that it was almost strange. It was as if on a still dark canvas, an eye-catching silver-white line extended infinitely along a black line. The picture was still, time was still, and everything was still, but the 2 lines kept moving forward. One was chasing and the other was escaping. When Brando stopped, the Nightsong Tiger was almost speechless. My lord, that is... Charge, a knight's skill. As a veteran of the mercenaries of Lopez, don't tell me you don't know this? Brendel glanced at him. No, I mean, my lord, how did you know it would use charge at that time? I was in the mountains of Orgish. The main opponent of the hunters was the Spectre Knight. Didn't I tell you this story before? Brando answered absent-mindedly. He was so nervous that he did not even know what he was talking about. It was a battle where he could lose his life if he was not careful, and to be honest, his heart was pounding with fear. He looked back and saw that the Spectre Knight had stopped almost at the same time. The elegant, almost pure, beautiful monster tightened its reins with its long silver-armored gloves, and two pale flames lit up under its mask as it looked in Roland's direction. The look in its eyes seemed to be a question. Who are you? You seem to be a difficult opponent. Where did you come from? The distance between the two of them was about 100 meters, but now it was less than 50 meters. Brando found that his estimation was not more than a meter off. He was almost relying on his instincts to fight. A warrior's instinct. In fact, it was not only the Nightsong Tiger who did not believe his words. When the two straight lines separated the forest into two, Amandina could not help but gasp in surprise. The mercenaries behind her were silent. Brando and the Spectre Knight's actions and judgments were exactly the same, as if the latter's every move could not escape the former's eyes. In fact, it took almost a second for them to realize how dangerous it had been before they realized what had happened. The Roman pursed her lips and looked in the direction of the battle with a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. If the younger generation of Karsuk's Highland Knight were all like this, then Erewhon would be one of the strongest countries in the world. Amandina took a short breath. This liar? But in reality, Brando was not as optimistic as she was. The Spectre Knight's speed was fast, and its charge still had a cooldown of 1 minute. Its soul fire was also burning brightly, and its ultimate skill was far more than that. The young man stopped and gestured to the Nightsong Tiger to follow him. The two of them quickly made their way to the center of the valley, where rocks intersected with each other to prevent the Spectre Knight from using his horse. However, Brando did not retreat blindly. The effect of the frostburst arrow was to buy him time. Now he needed to use the time that he had bought. Nightsong Tiger. Yes. Use wind arrow. What? Brando made a gesture, and the latter was stunned for a moment before he understood what he meant. Although this mercenary captain had always been against fighting this monster at this moment, he seemed to have subconsciously integrated into this battle. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 159. The Phantom Knight raised its spear for the third time, but its speed was significantly reduced. The Nightsong Tiger took the opportunity to shoot an arrow before the Phantom Knight could attack. The azure wind-binding arrow landed right in front of the Phantom Knight. The azure light around the Phantom Knight dissipated, and a layer of azure wind surrounded the Phantom Knight's hooves. The binding effect was in effect, and the Phantom Knight and its Phantom Warhorse slowed down. -12. 7%. Brando looked at the damage dealt to the Nightsong Tiger. When he saw the damage dealt to the Phantom Knight, he couldn't help but look at the Nightsong Tiger. The arrow was extremely accurate, and the binding effect was almost fully unleashed. Even though the Phantom Knight did not move at full speed, its trajectory was not something a steel-ranked player could capture. That meant the Nightsong Tiger was relying on his intuition. The mercenaries of Lopez really lived up to their reputation. Brando immediately grabbed the mercenary captain and retreated. The Phantom Knight's attack landed on their original position. Even though its speed was reduced by 10%, it was still much faster than Brando and the Nightsong Tiger. The only thing they could rely on was the distance between them. Distance was equivalent to time. The wind-binding arrow and ice-rending arrow had a duration of more than 5 minutes, unless they were dispelled. Even if low-level spells had a penalty on high-level targets, Brando was sure that the effect would last for more than 2 minutes and 20 seconds. They were less than 50 meters away from the ambush location. After the Ghost Knight missed its target, it immediately thrust its spear forward. The tip of the spear seemed to create a point of gravitational collapse, and the air around the spear made a sonic boom, causing the space to distort visually. The surrounding trees immediately leaned towards the center and snapped in half, as if a storm was being sucked towards the center. Brando looked back and saw the Nightsong Tiger's movement. The Phantom Knight signature move was the Phantom Knight signature move. In the early stages of the game, many players had lost their lives to the Phantom Knight skill. But this time, it was not enough to scare him. He dragged the Nightsong Knight into the intersecting rocks in the forest and used his energy drain skill. A green card flashed, and the Phantom Knight's body shook violently, dealing 300 damage to himself. Brando could not help but laugh wildly in his heart. He had not guessed wrong. Energy loss was indeed effective against this move. The Ghost Knight's Thousand-Man Strike was actually a soul spell. Although it was powerful, the players later discovered that it was actually very easy to avoid it. As long as there was a barrier sorcerer casting a stagnation barrier or an elementalist casting a binding curse, this spell would be nullified. Since energy drain was a counterattack spell, he thought it might be effective against this move. He didn't expect it to be so. The Ghost Knight's attack had taken away almost a third of its HP. According to the settings, it would enter a stun state for about 2 seconds, and then enter a state of full combat. However, this type of high-level undead had considerable intelligence. After suffering a loss, it would definitely not use the Thousand Army Strike again. Therefore, Brando did not have to worry about it continuously using big moves. 2 seconds was not a problem for an iron-ranked player to run 50 meters away. When the Ghost Knight recovered, Brando and the Nightsong Tiger were already panting as they waited for it at the preset ambush location. Everything that happened before was done under the limit. Even with Brando and the experienced mercenary captain's stamina, it was still a bit difficult. However, the Nightsong Tiger knew that the Ghost Knight was far from using its full strength. He could not help but sweat profusely as he looked at Brando, trying to figure out how this planeswalker could reverse the difference in strength. It was not only the Nightsong Tiger who was thinking this, everyone present had the same thought. In fact, when the elementalists saw the Ghost Knight's first attack, they could not help but shiver. This level of battle was beyond their imagination. Although the mercenaries of Lopez were known for their bravery and fighting prowess, it was like a battle between mortals. Above the mid-level of silver rank, the way of battle had long surpassed the common understanding of ordinary people. There was a famous incident in the Amber Sword. It was a battle caused by players that happened in Cruz's city of Baility at the end of the First Age. There were 11 gold-ranked players who participated in this battle, and it resulted in the destruction of half of the city of Baility, which had a population of 500,000. Although these players could not escape the fate of exile in the end, the destructive power of high-level players was vividly displayed in this incident. Of course, after that incident, every country strengthened the management of adventurers, but this was a story for later. The Ghost Knight's next attack made even the knowledgeable Amandina speechless. The power that seemed to be able to see through everything seemed to be able to distort nature. Although it was just an illusion, it still made people feel despair. The younger elementalist could not help but tremble. Her elder sister hugged her tightly, and the two of them gritted their teeth and persevered. This was also the mercenaries of Lopez's perseverance. If it was a normal mercenary, they would have run away by now. The rule of mercenaries was to keep their promises, but they were still humans. Everyone held their breaths. But a miracle seemed to have happened at this moment. After the Ghost Knight charged to a certain spot, it seemed to have an invisible line there, and it suddenly stopped. The undead raised its head, and its glowing eyes looked through the mask at the people in front of it. It raised its hand and waved its spear, creating 2 invisible gusts of wind. The gusts of wind plowed 2 deep trenches in the ground, and the black pine trees that could be seen everywhere suddenly swayed. But it was a pity that the gusts of wind disappeared before they could touch Brando and the Nightsong Tiger. What is this? The mercenary saw the Ghost Knight stopping behind the invisible line, and waving its spear futilely in an attempt to kill their lord and captain, but it proved that its efforts were futile because it could not reach them. At that moment, these people almost thought that it was as if God was helping them, and that it was Martha who was protecting their lord from the heavens. Even Amandina's eyes shone with a strange light, but she paused for a moment, and the light turned into doubt. The Roman clasped her hands together and let out a sigh, and a smile appeared on her face. She thought to herself that her Brando was the best. "Auntie, look, even the little Roman has an excellent lover." The mercenaries cheered, and even the Night Song Tiger looked at him in disbelief. But Brando did not relax at all. He had guessed correctly, and the Ghost Knight's range of activity was indeed in this position. In fact, it was not difficult to guess, and it could be guessed based on the patrol radius of the Monster Lord. The Ghost Knight's patrol radius was pitifully small, and it was a storyline monster, so its range of activity was even more limited. In fact, there was a formula for this, but Brando had never memorized it, and he could only rely on his experience. He made a gesture to the people behind him. Everyone entered the Ghost Knight's attack range. Everyone was stunned. "Isn't this good? We can hit it, but it can't hit us." Almost everyone thought so, and some of them could not help but take out their crossbows, as if they were afraid that their lord had forgotten that they had the ability to attack from a distance. "My lord," the Night Song Tiger could not help but say. "Listen to my orders." Brando interrupted him. Things were not that simple. If the Ghost Knight could not reach them, it would quickly turn back. Even though it was a quest monster, it was not stupid. Under his insistence, even though the mercenaries were unwilling, they still followed his orders and entered the Ghost Knight's attack range. Fortunately, with the slowing effect of the frost split arrow, this terrifying undead creature's attacks became predictable. These experienced mercenaries were able to dodge a single gust of wind pressure. Brando knew that as long as it did not use the Thousand Army Strike, even if the mercenaries of Lopez were in its attack range, it would not be able to do anything to them. It could only wave its spear in vain to show its presence. The mercenaries quickly realized this as well. Thus, the battle scene became very comical. The Ghost Knight was like a game of whack-a-mole, and the mercenaries were really like a group of rats, dodging around and occasionally retaliating with their ranged weapons. The only difference was that the Ghost Knight could never hit its target, and the mercenaries did not care about their image. As long as they could survive, it was enough. The Night Song Tiger was stunned by the scene. If the Ghost Knight's terrifying strength was beyond his understanding, then the strange battle between the two sides had once again exceeded his understanding. He had been in the battlefield for decades, but he had never seen such a battle. Brando saw the Night Song Tiger's expression and felt a little proud. He knew that in the past only a few people could decide the outcome of a battle. Knowledge was in the hands of a few people, and thus the thinking of war tended to be fixed. But he was different. He came from a more civilized world. At least half of his soul was like that. In that highly civilized society, universal education allowed everyone to have the right to think. Endless creativity allowed the players to develop endless tactics in this virtual world. In the era he lived in, there was a famous saying in the gaming industry: the more free the rules, the more difficult it was for the players. Players were always looking for ways to solve problems once and for all. They did not adhere to the rules, and used all the resources and advantages available to them to defeat the enemy. Brando was confident in this point. It was as if he represented the wisdom of the entire human race. Looking at this world from a different height, it was a world full of suffering and struggling to move forward in the darkness. He did not say anything and handed the remaining frost arrows to the Night Song Tiger. He believed that the old mercenary knew when to use the debuff on the Ghost Knight. The frost arrow was one of the most commonly used magic arrows, and the mercenaries of Lopez should know how to use it. The mercenary captain was stunned. "My lord, if you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading." Chapter 160. The mercenary captain noticed Brando's movement and paused for a moment. "My lord, I'll go around to its back." Brendel interrupted him and said, "The Ghost Knight may be an undead, but its intelligence was close to that of a normal human. It wasn't going to stay here and let these weaklings slowly drag it to death. As long as it had about 10% of its HP left, it would decisively retreat. But of course, Brando would not let this opportunity slip away. No, it's too dangerous." The Night Song Tiger paused for a moment. He could guess what Brando was going to do and quickly stopped him. "I'll go in your place." "You know what I'm going to do?" Brando retorted. As a matter of fact, he didn't want to do it. Although he was always the one to clean up the mess, He knew that the other party was a Spectre Knight, and in this world even the slightest mistake was intolerable. It was not as simple as losing a level, but losing one's life. Anyone who was faced with such a situation would be so nervous that their heart would be pounding. The only thing he could rely on was his innate ability, indomitable will. As long as his heart and head were protected, he could at least guarantee that he would not die like a normal person. At the very least, he could finish his will without any problems. "You can tell me what to do, my lord," the mercenary captain replied. "We're your subordinates after all, you don't have to do everything yourself." "I also wish to save you the trouble," Brando smiled and took out the rope from before. "But unfortunately, you can't learn this." "What is it?" "Do you know alchemy?" The Nightsong Tiger was stunned. If he knew alchemy, why would he need to be a mercenary? The middle-aged man could not help but roll his eyes. The battle did not come to an end that quickly. The Ghost Knight's defense was one of the best among level 35 elites, and even level 40 monsters. Not to mention other things, its glowing spiritual body armor could block most attacks. The four-armed crossbow provided by the army for iron-ranked soldiers was widely circulated among the mercenaries. Although it was prohibited, most nobles would turn a blind eye to it. However, this crossbow could only be deflected by a person with 5 ounces or above. Although it was terrifying in the eyes of normal people, it was no different from scratching an itch to the Ghost Knight. Only a few arrows that hit its vitals could deal effective damage, but at most it would only deal a few points of damage. Moreover, the Spectre Knight was not a wooden dummy. Although its agility was greatly reduced in the range of the altar, and it was bound by the wind-binding arrow, the difference in strength was still there. It was still able to dodge nimbly. This did not even take into account the 40% chance of damage to its body. But he was not in a hurry. The Nightsong Tiger still had 4 ice-rending arrows and 6 wind-binding arrows. With the remaining duration, he should be able to hold on for at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes, with more than 10 iron-ranked mercenaries surrounding him. Even a level 35 boss would lose a layer of skin. Not to mention a small elite. While the Spectral Knight was focused on playing whack-a-mole, Brendel took the opportunity to sneak into the forest behind it. The distance between him and the Spectral Knight was not too far, but it was about half the distance of the field. If he got any closer, the ghost might have noticed him, but if he got any further, the accuracy of his arrows would decrease. After all, he was no longer the level 130 warrior who could shoot the right eye but not the left eye from a few hundred meters away. He was a weapon master. It was better to be safe than sorry. However, he did not come here to ambush the Ghost Knight from behind. It might be effective, but the effect would not be great. Unless he had reached silver level rank 1 and learned a skill related to archery, he might be able to deal a critical hit and take away 10% of the Ghost Knight's HP. However, it was not possible now. He glanced at the battlefield not far away. The heated battle there was in stark contrast to the silence here. Brando took a deep breath and parted the bushes on the ground. He then drew an alchemy circle on the sand with his long sword. If Tamar was here, he would know that his previous advice was in vain. After drawing another energy infusion formation, he drew another blood refining formation. It was obvious that he was planning to bring this forbidden technique to greater heights. After that, he threw the coiled rope into the center of the magic circle and threw in the soul crystal he got from the Lich in Fortress Reden. To be honest, he was a little sad. The soul crystal of the intermediate Lich was not easy to get, especially since Madara and Erwin had already made peace. The next war would be many years later. If it was not for the fact that he did not have a better substitute, he would not have wasted such a precious material. Of course, his life was more important. He turned around and cut his finger with his long sword. A drop of blood fell into the circle. His heart suddenly tightened. Brando immediately felt that his HP was reduced by more than a third. The higher the grade of the material, the higher the energy requirement. Although he had expected this, he was still surprised. He could not help but laugh. He was glad that the only material he had was not the demon dragon's heart. Otherwise, he would have been sucked dry. Of course, this was just a thought. If he really had the demon dragon's heart, he would have just taken it to the Emperor of Cruz. He could even change the king of a duchy. But when he thought of the rare material, he could not help but feel his heart skip a beat. He also remembered the thing in his backpack. He could not help but open his backpack to take a look. A golden light was reflected in the young man's eyes. The light seemed to have a life of its own as it pulsated rhythmically, just like a heart. Brando took a deep breath. This was a secret that he did not tell anyone. There was no other reason because it was too important. Of course, he was almost sure who put this thing in his backpack. It was just that he did not understand. It was just a chance encounter. The other party did not seem to have any reason to do this. What was the motive? Framing? Or probing? Brando was not happy when he thought of this. To be honest, this thing was important to some people, but it was not of much use to him. He was only 4 levels away from activating his second talent, but he already had a goal, and he did not rely on this thing. He thought for a while, but he still had no clue. So his mind quickly returned to reality. At present, his biggest problem was the ghost knight. It was better to put other things aside for the time being. He glanced at the alchemy product in the circle. It was originally an ordinary rope, but now it had become as black as ink, and it was constantly emitting a faint black light. This thing looked like an immortal binding rope. Of course, in terms of color, compared to the shiny immortal binding rope in many cultivation novels, it might need to be renamed the demon binding rope. Brendel mocked himself for a moment. He knew that this thing was actually a crude alchemy product that could not be any cruder. He simply injected the energy from the soul crystal into the rope. But what made him not know whether to laugh or cry was that the raw materials used were ridiculously high quality, which was why this ordinary rope had turned into such a state. He thought that if Tamar knew that he was wasting God's gifts so recklessly, she would probably use the Soul Walker to give him a beating. Oh right. In this history, the future master alchemist had not yet refined the so-called semi-divine scythe. Brando immediately realized this and corrected his thoughts. He picked up the rope and looked at the other side of the battlefield, quietly waiting for the moment when the battle was over. The Spectre Knight was struggling in vain. At first, it hit a few people with its Spear of Spirit, but those were just scratches caused by the wind pressure. But soon the mercenaries became more cautious, and the fierce undead immediately exposed its nature as a paper tiger. Although the undead creature was not afraid or happy, it gradually became a little impatient. Especially the mount it was sitting on, which could not help but raise and lower its 4 hooves in annoyance. Seeing this scene, the Nightsong Tiger was a little worried at first. His main concern was that the Spectre Knight would launch another 1,000 army strike. However, the Spectre Knight was able to endure it after suffering a setback. After all, if it launched another 1,000 army strike, it might directly kill him. The Ghost Knight had the ability to calculate, so naturally, it would not make such a low-level mistake. Of course, it did not know that it had been making a low-level mistake all along. The mercenary captain fired the last frostburst arrow. After nearly 10 minutes of fighting, the Spectre Knight could no longer hold on. Its upper body, which was almost covered in a thick layer of frost, began to creak, then began to retreat. The undead creature retreated so quickly that it was almost beyond everyone's imagination. They thought that after being hit by so many ice bolts, the undead creature's mobility would be limited, but it seemed that it was only a little. The Nightsong Tiger reacted quickly and immediately shot another wind-binding arrow, but unfortunately, it did not have much effect. The mercenaries exclaimed in surprise, and some of them wanted to chase after it, but the Nightsong Tiger immediately stopped them. What a joke! If the Ghost Knight turned around and attacked them, they would all die here. It would be fine if they died here, but if Brando died, then they would be doomed eternally. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the forest. He knew that the mysterious lord would come up with a solution. Unknowingly, the mercenaries had developed a kind of trust in Brando. But as expected, 2 shining silver arrows appeared in the dark forest one after the other, like 2 white lines that stretched forward against the black background. It was so eye-catching. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 161. Guiding Arrow. Someone shouted from the back. It was the Elementalist sisters. They were the ones who made the magic arrows, and only they knew the effects of the arrows. These 2 silver arrows had the most unique magic brilliance among all the types of magic arrows. Other than the guiding arrow, there was no other possibility. But in fact, even if they didn't say it, the other mercenaries also saw it. But why did their lord use the guiding arrow at this time? Although the guiding arrow was a magic arrow, its damage was no different from an ordinary crossbow. To put it bluntly, it was not as powerful as a steel crossbow shot from a four-armed crossbow. Other than its accuracy, it was useless. Could it be that the Lord knew the monster's weakness? This thought flashed through everyone's mind at this moment. But things didn't go as they wished, because they saw the two guiding arrows nailed into the trunks of two tall trees. With two soft sounds, the arrows went straight into the trees. Wait, did they miss? Everyone couldn't help but have such a strange thought at this moment. If it was possible, many of them would be sweating profusely at this moment. Since ancient times, no one had ever heard of anyone being able to deflect a guided arrow. What kind of powerful ability did one have to be able to deflect a guided arrow with magic? But this was not the time to be amazed by such a powerful ability. Wait, what is that? However, there were a few sharp-eyed mercenaries among the dozen or so mercenaries. They finally saw a thin line behind the two guiding arrows. No, it was not a line but a rope. The two guiding arrows that went into the trunks of the two tall trees pulled the rope straight up to the chest. At this moment, it was less than 3 meters away from the ghost knight who was galloping in the forest. A tripping rope. Everyone finally came to their senses, but they didn't have time to be amazed by Brando's wonderful idea, because there was another problem. The ghost knight was a spiritual creature, and physical restrictions couldn't affect it at all without hitting its core. Could it be that the Lord had not considered this point? The ghost knight desperately hoped that Brando had not considered this point. Unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. The number of ghost knights that Brando had killed in his previous life was probably more than the total number of ghost knights that had died in this world. How could he forget such a common-sense question? A black light flashed on the rope, and the ghost knight and his horse stood up high. If the knight and the horse were real, they would have easily broken the thin rope at this speed. But at this moment, the soul power attached to the rope made the undead suffer. It felt as if it had hit a steel cable. Then it was lifted into the air and flew backward. This was the moment Brando had been waiting for. The ghost knight was too agile, and he could not aim while riding on his mount. However, it was different now. Before elemental activation, he had never heard of anyone who could turn around in midair. As for the divine skill of stepping on the back of the right foot and turning in midair, it was even more unheard of. He raised his hand, and the ruby ring that Freya gave him shone in the dark. His heart moved and a laser-like red line shot out from the ruby, hitting the chest of the ghost knight in midair. Flame! He chanted the activation words and a golden light bloomed. This light moved along the red line from slow to fast. In the blink of an eye, it had hit the undead that had not had time to fall to the ground. At that moment, it was as if the surrounding starlight had dimmed and was absorbed by a point with the golden light as the center. The surroundings became extremely dark, and then a ball of fire seemed to bloom from the center of the darkness. With a roar, the air shot in all directions like knives. The air traveled so fast that the sound was misplaced. After a moment of extreme silence, Brando heard a terrible roar that swept through his entire hearing. With the explosion as the center, all the trees within a 10-meter radius were vaporized, and the soil crystallized. Further away, the leaves were charred and curled up, and the heat waves rolled, washing the faces of everyone present. Everyone was stunned, and the younger of the two wild elves murmured, "Fireball, is the Lord still an elementalist with silver-level strength?" As the elder elemental, she covered her fair forehead with her hand and replied, "It's just a magic item." But even so, the girl's voice could not hide the surprise. She could hardly believe that they had won, and there were almost no casualties. They had indeed won. Brando had received the EXP prompt that he had successfully reached level 23. 2 more levels and the second talent could be activated. Compared to the first talent, which was only to reflect the characteristics of the characters, the second talent was the core talent that determined the later development path of a character. It was also the most important talent. It's a pity that the flying time of Fireball is still too long, otherwise it would be much easier to use this directly. Brando sighed. He looked at the crackling forest and knew that the flames would soon be extinguished, because there was no real fire here, and the extremely high temperature only existed at the moment of the explosion. The flames that everyone saw now were just an illusion formed by the elemental clusters. Otherwise, no one in the game would choose to use fire spells. A fireball would reduce the loot by half, and no one could accept it. He let out a long sigh, took out a water bag and drank. This battle could not be said to be exhausting, and it was not even comparable to many of the battles he had experienced in the game in the past. At that time, sometimes people did not even have the strength to move their fingers after a day. But this time was different, and it was a real race against time. Every opportunity was so precious and important that he could not afford to make a mistake. Fortunately, he found that he had not thrown away all his past experiences. But he was sighing, and what happened in the fire soon made him stop in surprise. When the flames dissipated, Brando found that the ghost knight did not turn into ashes. Instead, it was lying quietly on the ground, and the evil spirit mount stopped beside it, gently touching its master's hand. It was just that the soul fire of the evil spirit mount and the ghost knight that were shining in the dark had dissipated to varying degrees. This dissipation was continuing, and the spiritual armor on their bodies quickly cracked and dissipated like a layer of smoke, revealing the body that was originally wrapped in heavy armor, or a layer of shell. The spirit of the unicorn. Brando was stunned as he looked at the beautiful body of the evil spirit mount after the bone layer made of soul power fell off. It was like the most majestic and muscular warhorse, and its beautiful body and the long horn on its forehead all showed its identity. But wait, in the legends of Wond, didn't the unicorn only become the mount of the purest girl? The young man subconsciously looked down and couldn't help but spit out the mouthful of water in his mouth. Some even choked his nose, causing him to cough violently. After the armor of the ghost knight completely dissipated, there was actually an elven girl sleeping peacefully under the armor, like a princess. No, it should be said that it was the soul of an elven girl. The silver mark on her forehead was still there, which in the customs of the silver elves meant that she was not yet an adult. It seemed that this was a child who died young, but now was not the time to sigh. Brando thought of the fierce ghost knight that fought with them for 300 rounds. It was actually an underage girl? Who could tell him what kind of ridiculous situation was this? But fortunately, the soul of the elven girl was still wearing a very soft long dress after the spiritual armor disintegrated, so Brando would not be in a more awkward situation. At this time, the others gathered around. They originally came to congratulate their lord and celebrate. But just like Brando, when they saw the appearance of their enemy, they were all stunned. This is... The Nightsong Tiger looked at the translucent spirit lying quietly in the middle of the empty space created by the fireball, and did not know what to say for a moment. Amandina was also shocked and asked, "The one from before, was it her?" Brando nodded. Even though it was a little unbelievable, it seemed to be the truth. Besides, it wasn't impossible. After all, evil spirits wouldn't appear out of thin air. In fact, he had suspected that the Spectre Knight might be the projection of the souls of the Silver Elf Kings in the tomb of the Silver Elf Kings, but he didn't expect it to be a lowly. Amandina frowned and reluctantly accepted this explanation. "Did we kill her?" a voice asked. Brando turned his head and saw that the one who spoke was the younger of the wild elven sisters. Unlike her elder sister who only frowned slightly, this little girl was clearly concerned about whether they killed one of her kind. In fact, the wild elves and the silver elves were obviously different. Even though the elves and the winged elves in Wond were called the embodiment of beauty, the wild elves' beauty was like the warm afternoon sun, bright and warm. In fact, the wild elves were one of the races that had the best relationship with humans. Many of them lived and reproduced in human society. On the other hand, the silver elves were cold and unapproachable. Because of the ancient prophecy, they had long been isolated from the world and left the world with a mysterious and arrogant impression. The silver elves were generally taller than humans, and their bodies were slender and graceful. They were the first nobles of the land and were born to be nobles. The feeling they gave others was like the cold and beautiful moonlight. The spirit of the elven girl lying quietly on the ground was a stark contrast to the wild elven sisters. The young man's gaze fell on the Roman again. The young lady's eyes expressed the same desire, but in comparison, she seemed to want the answer she was looking for more. Brando shook his head and his gaze fell on the spirit's body. This phenomenon meant that the spirit's power was disintegrating, and the power that maintained the elven girl's existence in this world was extremely weak. Even though she did not immediately disappear, it was likely that she would not be able to hold on for long. She died long ago. Even now, her spirit is only on the verge of disintegrating. Romain let out a sigh of pity. But when Brando said this, he could not help but click his tongue. Just how much life did she have? After taking a hit from his strike of the 1,000 armies, being beaten up by the mercenaries for half a day, and then followed up with a fireball spell, she should have died even if she was 10 levels higher. But the reality was that the elven girl was lying there perfectly fine. She was Sleeping Beauty. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 162. In the dream, the palace of the Silver Elves was still the same as in his memory. The white spires, the white arches, the white corridors, and the white railings. How long ago was that dream? Sister, what's your name? The voice in the dream was as sharp as ever. I'm sorry. In the dream, he remembered his mother saying that when he gently pressed his hand to his chest, he could feel the beating of the heart and the residual warmth of life in his palm. Only when he was close to it would he feel at ease. But it was precisely because of this that the scenery of his childhood in Charlotte Village became clear. He really wanted to go back to that time. I'm sorry, sister. I'm sorry, father. It's all my fault. Brando's words also made him realize something else. Rather than saying that the little girl had too much blood, it might be better to say that there was another possibility. That was the setting of the storyline mission. The strategy guide did not mention the details of how to activate the altar, although Brando believed that he could find the right way with his own experience. But now it seemed that the method was already in front of him. But since it was a mission, then the little girl would probably wake up soon. After all, the game would not let the players wait for too long. Brando raised his head and looked at the starry night sky, wondering if this world was the same. The mercenaries were whispering to each other. Amandina grabbed Roman's hand and looked nervously at the underage silver elf girl on the ground. No one dared to get too close. After all, the spirit of the unicorn was still guarding by her side. Who knew if it would suddenly attack and hurt people? But as Brando expected, soon the little girl's eyelashes moved, and then she opened her eyes. It was a pair of somewhat confused eyes. The rainbow was silver and seemed a little hollow. But the hollow eyes seemed to be injected with a lot of things in an instant, like memories, emotions, and some more complicated factors. After a pause, the little girl's body moved. She turned her head and everyone's faces, including Brando's, were reflected in her vision. She seemed to remember something. She frowned and showed a painful expression, then curled up and coughed violently. She released her hand, and her palm was covered in silver blood. Then she trembled as she groped around on the ground. She gritted her teeth and tried to grab the silver spear on the other side. The mercenaries drew their weapons vigilantly, and some of them seemed to want to stop her. Brendel, she can't fight anymore. Amandina turned around and whispered to Brendel. The elven girl's previous performance seemed to have touched this noble lady. She had been down and out before, so she could empathize with the elven girl. It was as if the elven girl had struck the weakest spot in her heart. She did not have the ability to fight anymore. Brando nodded. This spirit had already entered the final stage of death. At this time, even if he stood there and let her kill him, she would not have the ability to do so. A spirit was able to stay in this world by relying on a persistent wish for something. This wish was the power of her soul. However, after the power of her soul dissipated, her last connection with this world would disappear as well. From then on, the meaning of this little elf girl's words completely disappeared from this world without a trace. Indeed, after groping for a while, the elf girl suddenly stopped, because she saw that her hand on the ground was faintly discernible, as if it was going to disappear at any time. Brando raised his hand and stopped the others. In fact, he did not need to remind them. The mercenaries all stopped their actions. If the specter knight from before was so powerful that it struck fear in people's hearts, then this elven girl's specter was so weak that it made people want to protect her. Mr. Human, am I going to disappear? The elf girl looked at her disappearing hand in a daze and suddenly asked. Her voice was like a nightingale in an empty forest. It was unbelievably pleasant. Even the wild elf sister could not help but exclaim softly, The wild elves were also excellent musicians. However, in front of the elven nobles, the silver elves, they were still inferior in every aspect. Ever since the elves of Wone passed down from the golden bloodline, there were only two purest silver elves. One was the silver elves and the other was the mist elves. Because the golden bloodline had long disappeared, the silver elves and the mist elves became the elven royalty. Brando nodded silently. The quest came, but he suddenly found that he could not be happy. In the game, he would not be affected by this scene because he knew that it was just an NPC. But here, he found that he could not be cold-blooded. "You," Amandina whispered. "That knight from before. Was it you?" The elf girl did not answer and nodded silently. Her arms and legs were beginning to become transparent, but she looked up and forced a smile. "I killed a lot of people. So Lady Martha must have abandoned me." "That's not your fault," Brando replied. "That incident in history was indeed the Holy Cathedral of Fire was not kind enough, or else Lady Martha would not be so furious. In fact, Erwin's fate had been declining ever since. Besides, he had basically figured out the cause and effect. It must be that the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wanted to change the contract between the ancient silver elves, Martha, and the elven goddess Shay. Brando had done things like changing the contract of the gods before. It was not complicated, but it was very risky. He was a player, so he naturally could bear it. He did not know where Erwin's people got the guts to do it, but in the end, it still allowed the evil spirits to take advantage of the situation. That led to a tragedy. Presumably, this little girl was not the only one controlled by the evil spirits at that time, but the high-ranking monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were not to be trifled with. After a tragic battle that was not recorded in history, this temple disappeared from all official records from then on, and was ruined until now. "What's your name?" Brando found that even at this time, the Romans' question was still so constructive. "My name is Medisha, and my surname is Crescent Moon," the elf girl answered. "You're not of the royal family?" Brando and Amandina were stunned, and asked in unison. The royal family of the Silver Elves had the same surname as the Empire. The Heron royal family was the purest of the Silver Elves, and if they were not of the purest blood, they would not be able to enter this tomb. "Yes, I'm the daughter of an artisan. But this is the tomb of the Silver Elves." Amandina pressed on. This question stunned the elf girl for a while, and half of her body gradually became transparent. "Because of some special reasons," she said. "Special reasons? I heard that the Silver Elves would bury their greatest heroes with their ancient kings." Amandina recited the words from the book, but she looked at the little girl suspiciously. No matter how she looked at her, she did not look like the greatest hero. The elf girl stroked her unicorn, and her eyes became gentle. "It's not like that. I'm actually here on behalf of someone else." "What?" Brando almost spat out a second mouthful of water. In that era, he had heard of people taking exams on behalf of others, but he had never heard of people occupying tombs on behalf of others. "What is this?" "Waiting in line." But Amandina was much sharper than him, and she immediately asked, "Dying on behalf of others? Or buried with others?" Brando was stunned. "Substitute." He thought to himself, what a ridiculous development. Who would have thought that the noble and elegant Silver Elves would do such a thing? They looked no different from humans. But the elf girl immediately shook her head. "I'm here of my own accord." "Of your own accord?" Brando was in disbelief. A faint smile appeared on the elf girl's face, as if she thought of something proud. "I'm here on behalf of my sister, for the princess." When she said this, the lower half of her body was almost transparent to the point where it was almost invisible. "Wait," Brando interrupted her. "Sister? Your Highness, what's going on? My mother is an elven artisan of Chero village, but my father is the emperor of the Heron Empire. I think I can be considered half a princess." "So your sister is the princess of the Silver Elves Empire?" The girl nodded. "What's going on?" "My sister was cursed by the Myrna people during the battle. The court mage said to my father that unless someone related to her by blood died in her place, she would be weak for the rest of her life until she died." The elf girl slowly narrated. "But my sister is the most outstanding general in the empire. No matter if it's the dwarves, the human allies, or our people, no one wants this to happen. So my father chose me. Amandina frowned. He's your father. How could he do such a thing? But Brando held her back. She did not understand how powerful the Dark Dragon was in the Year of Chaos. Every race paid a huge price to fight against that existence. Medicia's father was the ruler of the Heron Empire, so it was normal for him to make such a choice. He looked at the elf girl and was silent for a while. Then he asked, "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I want to ask you for a favor?" As expected, Brando thought. What favor? The lizard men in the forest took my sister's necklace from my tomb. I don't know what they want to do with it. But without that item, the curse won't be able to stay on me. I'm worried. Amandina was depressed and could not help but interrupt her. You're going to disappear and you're still worried about others. The elven girl glanced at the noble's daughter and smiled. Because of this, I hope that my disappearance will be more meaningful. Amandina was speechless. This is your own matter, we have the right to refuse, right? Brando asked again. Even though his rationality told him to accept this request, he did not know why, but he was a little angry when he saw this girl who seemed to be aloof from worldly affairs. The girl looked up and her eyes flashed with a hint of slyness. Human. Sir, you're here to seek the help of the ancient kings, right? Her body was almost completely transparent. You know. I can hear even the slightest breeze in the valley. She closed her eyes and answered, but in order to obtain the recognition of the ancient kings, you must first obtain my recognition. So, I want to make a deal with you. He was actually threatened, and by a little girl at that. Brando felt bitter. Could he turn against her? He looked back at Amandina and the Roman, and the two girls and the Nightsong Tiger nodded. All right, but I have a request, Brando said. I want to obtain the help of the ancient kings. Otherwise, using our strength to deal with the lizardmen bandits in the forest is no different from throwing an egg at a rock. The girl nodded. I've already agreed. She answered. Brando was surprised. You're not worried that I'll go back on my word? Of course. I'm worried. The elf girl was silent for a moment before she answered. Then why? The girl suddenly coughed. She looked up again and her face was full of tears. Of course I'm worried. But I don't want to disappear. I still have things to do. I'm sorry, can you help me? The wind in the mountains blew past the top of the forest, and a sobbing sound could be heard from afar. Everyone was stunned at that moment. Although she had clearly disappeared without a trace, the last words of the elven girl's sobbing seemed to linger in everyone's ears. Brando looked back at the others, and for a moment he could not say a word. His fourth update. Carrying the silver elf lowly on my back for support. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 163. Her sobs were carried away by the wind, and the forest returned to silence. Brendel sighed. He turned around and saw the hope in Romain and Amandina's eyes. Even though they were enemies just a moment ago, everything that happened before was not Melissa's fault. Moreover, the elven girl's background was truly pitiful. She's a girl with a soft heart. Even though they were enemies just a moment ago, everything that happened before was not her fault. You want to save her? Romain nodded her head like she was pounding garlic. Amandina was slightly more reserved after hearing Brendel's words. She bit her lips and wanted to say something, but every time she wanted to say something, she would swallow it back down. My lord. The Nightsong Tiger spoke from the other side. Brando was surprised. He did not expect the Nightsong Tiger to speak. He could not help but ask in surprise, You're a mercenary. The Nightsong Tiger immediately shut his mouth, but his voice immediately sounded in his mind. My lord, this is an opportunity. As a planeswalker, my lord does not have a high-quality card. The elven girl is very strong, and if you seal her, it is not impossible to create a high-quality card. That would require her to be willing. Brando replied in his mind. In fact, he had thought of this method from the beginning. Creating blank cards was a basic skill for a planeswalker, but with Brando's current strength, He could only create a contract card that consumed 100 wealth and a small amount of mana. These cards could only be used when the sealing party was extremely weak and willing. 100 wealth might be a drop in the ocean for a veteran planeswalker, but for Brando, it was just enough for a month's worth of savings. If Medisha did not agree, then he would lose 100 wealth for nothing. It was impossible to say that he did not feel the pain. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the merchant lady and Amandina, and looked at Brando's hopeful expression. He knew his lord's choice. The middle-aged mercenary smiled slightly and replied in his mind, "But if I don't try, I will feel uneasy." Brando could not help but smile awkwardly. That was indeed the case, but rather than saying that he did not want to disappoint Roman and Amandina, it was more accurate to say that he did not want to disappoint himself. What happened in his previous life was destined to be unchangeable, but it might not be the case in this life. Because he was here, he believed that his inexplicable arrival in this world was not without meaning. 100 wealth. Not only was he giving Medisha a chance, but he was also giving himself a chance. From this point of view, it was definitely worth it. He pulled out a blank card from his deck. There wasn't much of a difference between a blank card and a card of fate. The only difference was that the front of the card was blank, like an empty room waiting for a guest. "What's that?" Roman asked curiously when he saw the card that Brando took out. "My lord is saving the little elf girl," the Nightsong Tiger replied. "He's engraving her soul into the card to stabilize her soul fire." Amandina's eyes flashed. "It sounds like a summoner's ability, but don't summoners use crystals? How can they seal souls that aren't monsters?" "It can also be considered as a type of summoning ability," the Nightsong Tiger replied. "But it's also a last resort because it's the only way. I can't think of any other way to keep this little girl in this world." Amandina and Roman nodded. They could understand Brando's actions. After all, the destruction of the soul fire meant the complete loss of existence. The energy would be reduced to the most basic elements and scattered throughout the world, and would not return to the embrace of Gaia in the normal sense. Such a method of disappearance was the most painful for any living being, let alone the highly intelligent elves. Brando showed the card to the empty space. "Medisha, are you willing to travel with me and become a part of the laws of this world?" He opened his mouth, and it was as if there was a voice in his heart that spoke at the same time. The blank card flew out from his hand and floated in the air. Brando waited for a response, but there was no response even after a minute. He sighed in pity and almost thought that Medisha had disappeared. But at this time, a small voice suddenly spoke. "I have a wish, can it be granted?" "Brando." "No, Lord Planeswalker." It was Medisha's voice. Brando sighed heavily. "Of course, Miss Medisha. Please speak. Travel with you. I want to see my sister. Just once is enough." The small voice replied. Brando was taken aback. He thought it was some kind of request. Even if it was absolute freedom, it was not impossible for him to accept it. But he did not expect Medisha's wish to be so simple. The Silver Elves lived for a long time. This elven girl's father and sister might still be alive at this time, so this wish was not unattainable. It was just that it was a little troublesome because they had hidden away from the world. So he thought for a moment and nodded. A black light flashed on the card, and then he saw a row of words appear on his retina. "The contract is established." Then another prompt appeared. "A new deck has been discovered, please name it Eternal Song." Since it was a silver elf, he should name it after the silver elf's most famous army in ancient times. Brando thought. After the light on the card faded, it fell down to his hand. Brando picked up the card. On the card was a female knight wearing silver armor and holding a shuttle-shaped spear with a gentle smile. It was Medisha. Unicorn Knight, Eternal Song I Dark 15 creature. Heroic Spirit Knight. Level 35 Elite. Put Unicorn Knight Medisha New Moon into the field. Maintenance cost. When Medisha New Moon is in the field, pay Dark 1/6 of wealth per day. The elven flag flutters high, the heart shines, the sword shines. Brando held the card and did not know what to do for a moment. The card responded with a cold touch, proving that it was not a normal card. Brando also thought about how high the quality of Medisha's sealed card could be. After all, she was an existence that had entered the gold tier. But he did not expect it to be a silver tier card. An ancient item. Other than the Sword of Light, this was the second ancient item he had obtained. Tumen had told him that the cards of fate were much rarer than magic items of the same tier, so he had thought about what the second ancient item he could obtain would be. But he had never thought that it would be a card of fate. But reality had given him a heavy blow. Now it seemed that he did not lose that 100 wealth. Instead, he made a huge profit. Brando wanted to laugh out loud, if not for the fact that he had to maintain his image in front of his subordinates. He had always had a headache because of the various powerful enemies he encountered. He even thought that he was cursed in this life, or else why would he have to do things that were beyond his level? First, he fought Madara's army as a newbie. Then, he defeated the White Knight before reaching level 15. Then, he played a race of life and death with the Crusader Executioner and Brags. Not to mention the gold tier Turstival for one. Then, after a few months of leisure, he had to fight Buga again. Then, in less than 3 days, the Tree Herders, the Oracle, and the Ghost Knight came out one after another. It was simply unbearable. Although he did not fear All for One, Tree Herders, Madara, or other terrorist organizations like All for One, he did not fear the feeling of being watched by strong enemies all the time. Trust me, it was definitely not a good feeling. But now it was different. He had a gold tier follower. Even if it was only a gold tier follower, at least in the southern part of Erewhon, he could do whatever he wanted. No matter how powerful the Tree Herders and All for One were, they could not send a gold tier assassin to kill him, right? That was a method used by these two organizations to deal with enemies of the Count level and above. Brando did not think that he had reached that level yet. Moreover, even if a gold tier opponent came with his experience and Medicia's strength, it would be easy to deal with the problem. It was better than him, who was not even a silver tier, having to bite the bullet, right? All in all, at this moment, he felt that the dark clouds had parted and the sun was shining. This is the feeling of riding on someone's coattails. Good people have good karma. Brando could not help but think to himself. Then he turned his head and held back his laughter as he waved the card of fate in his hand to the others. Done, everyone. Amandina and Roman's eyes lit up, especially Romaine, who could not help but urge. That's great, Brando. Quickly summon Medicia and let us take a look. Ahem. Brando coughed and his expression changed. Roman's words could be said to have poked at his sore spot. Although the Unicorn Knight card was a divine artifact to him at this moment, there was a problem that he had to face. The summoning cost of this card was a full 15 points of Dark EP. Moreover, there was a high 6 points of wealth and 1 point of Dark EP daily maintenance fee. Not to mention where Brando was going to find so many Dark EP, just the 6 points of wealth daily maintenance fee was enough to make him bankrupt. The rich gold mine card that he had attached to the Sacred Tree's secret ground only brought in 4 points of wealth daily, and he still had to deduct 2 points of Mercenaries of Lopez maintenance fee. If he added Medicia into the equation, he would need at least 2 gold mines to make up for it. Brando could not help but smack his forehead. Only now did he know that salt and rice were expensive. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 164. It took a lot of effort to explain the summoning rules of the Cards of Fates to Romaine and Amandina. After explaining that he was temporarily unable to summon Medicia, Brendel's identity as a planeswalker was also revealed. Fortunately, the perceptive noble lady didn't suspect the Mercenaries of Lopez for the time being. After all, it was too unimaginable. However, Brando was not worried that they would find out the truth. The reason was simple. The only person Amandina could rely on was him. He believed that he had the ability to make her trust him. Of course, this was nonsense. Brando thought to himself that he had been in this world for 500 years and 100 years. If he still could not deceive a little girl, then he would not be worthy of being called a hardcore gaming nerd in his previous life. He put away the Unicorn Knight card, and then ordered 2 mercenaries to investigate in the direction of the temple. At the same time, a few mercenaries had already brought him the spoils of war. As the Ghost Knight, Medicia only left behind 2 items, a pair of boots and a crystal. When Brando saw the crystal, he almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. However, he rubbed his eyes to make sure that he was not dreaming. No, this must be a dream. Otherwise, how could he, who was known as the unlucky king in the game, encounter such good things one after another. Just like the last time when he did not obtain the heart of the tree from the golden tree boss, he was not surprised at all because of his good karma. It was normal that he did not get anything good. If he did get something good, then it must be an illusion. But after he confirmed it again, he had to admit that the crystal in the mercenaries of Lopez's hands was indeed the Ghost Knight's crystal. The Ghost Knight's crystal. Enhanced item, arm. Increases damage by plus 10% after equipping. Brando pinched Roman's face. The latter immediately raised her eyebrows in protest. What are you doing, Brando? Although she knew that this level of protest was nothing to Brando, he really hurt her this time. She could not help but complain loudly. No, I'm just making sure that I'm not dreaming. Brando replied as if he was sleepwalking. Pinch yourself, damn it. Roman was so angry that he lifted his boots and kicked him. This time, Brando knew that he was not dreaming because of the pain. Hiss. Serves you right. Roman, you're not allowed to wear boots next time. No way. Amandina couldn't help but shake her head as she looked at the two of them who had suddenly become like children. She saw the mercenaries snickering and knew that their lord must be in a good mood to be like this. However, when she looked at the crystal, she wondered if it was really that important. This is the Ghost Knight's crystal? As she thought about this, she couldn't help but ask her question. Not only her, but the others were not idiots, especially the Nightsong Tiger. They were all waiting for Brando to tell them what the crystal was for. In their hearts, Brando's knowledge was already common knowledge, so they were not surprised. Hearing the noble's question, Brando stopped. He nodded and replied, "Yes, this is the Ghost Knight's crystal." Then he could not help but smile. It seems that my prophecy came true. A day trip to Ampere Seal is inevitable. Compared to the value of the crystal itself, the mercenaries were obviously more willing to hear this. They did not understand what a prophecy meant, but a day trip to Ampere Seal was easy to understand. Hearing this, they could not help but cheer in unison. Although it was a creature summoned by a card, it still had its own memories and feelings. But Amandina did not care about this. Ampere Seal was Erewhon's largest free port. When she was very young, she went there with her father once, but other than the prosperity, it did not leave a deep impression. But when she remembered her irresponsible father, she could not help but deliberately avoid this thought and asked, "Is this crystal really that important?" "Of course." Brando answered matter-of-factly. His tone was so indisputable. As an item that appeared in the previous versions of the Amber Sword, it could still be sold for a sky-high price of 300 million Tor in the later stages of the game. Even if it was converted to RMB, it could be sold for 3,000 to 4,000 Tor on the trading platform. One had to know that this was just a virtual strengthening gem, so the value of this thing was obvious. The enhancement crystal was a type of implant, and a level 20 character could have 3 spots to enhance: arms, head and torso. Because the enhancement crystal was an item that could not be lost in the game, its value was often higher than normal equipment. Of course, in this world, this advantage had lost its value, but it did not change its value. At least, from the lesson of the Thorn of Light, the enhancement crystal could not be lost. Damage output was explosive power, and increasing explosive power by 10% was equivalent to increasing offensive power by the same amount. Because Brando had enough experience to push Strength Burst to level 10 when he leveled up, his explosive power could reach 30 ounces when he activated it, and this crystal could provide him with a 10% increase in strength, which was equivalent to 3 ounces. After reaching level 20, the power of 3 ounces was equivalent to that of an ancient item. Moreover, this was only the early stages. What would it be like when he had a few hundred OZ in the later stages? Brando could imagine how much this thing could bring him. If this thing has a price, Brando smiled and said as he picked up the crystal, then it's worth 300 million. 300 million? The mercenaries' faces turned green. If Brando said that this thing was worth 3 million, they might have felt their breathing quicken. However, 300 million was the annual revenue of a wealthy duchy. These mercenaries who were born commoners didn't know how to react to this number. They could only think that Brando was joking. Not only them, even the Roman did not believe him. Amandina lightly snorted and glared at Brando. Amandina furrowed her brows, thinking that this guy was boasting again. But Brando did not care whether these people believed him or not. He happily implanted this thing into his right hand, and it immediately flowed into his body through the crystal. But he was already used to this feeling in the game, so he casually picked up the pair of metal shin guards. However, as soon as he picked it up, he almost screamed and threw it away. Flesh shin guard, brass plus 10, 5% movement speed plus 5 vitality, level requirement 20, equipment level 20 ounces. Brando suddenly felt that the world was a little unreal, even though this world was not real to him. But was this a sign of the end of the world? He definitely did not believe that he would be promoted to the legendary face fighter one day. A Spectre Knight crystal and brass equipment. After all, it was only an Elite Quest boss. It wasn't even considered a boss. He was stunned for a moment, but he immediately remembered something. Who was the one who went to loot the corpse? He hurriedly asked. Loot the corpse? Everyone was stunned. What did that mean? But when Brando saw the expressions of his subordinates, he realized that he had said something wrong. In a moment of panic, he even blurted out, "Loot the corpse." He hurriedly coughed and corrected himself. I meant, who was the one who went to clean up the battlefield? This question was a little complicated. Was there a need to pay special attention to cleaning up the battlefield? The mercenaries looked at each other, and there was a moment of silence. But finally a voice spoke. It was me, my lord. What's the matter? The voice was a little cold. Brando turned his head and saw that it was the elder sister of the Elementalist sisters. She raised her head to look at him, but it was difficult to hide the trace of nervousness in her eyes. When Brando spoke so hurriedly, it was inevitable that she would think that she had done something wrong. Nothing, Brando nodded. In the future, the task of cleaning up the battlefield will be handed over to you. Me? The elven lady was stunned. She held back and pressed one hand to her chest and asked again. Anyone could see that this was a rare honor, but she did not understand what she had done to attract the Lord's favor. She thought for a long time and could only think of some bad habits of some nobles, so she could not help but look at Brando with a little suspicion. But Brando was not in the mood to explain to her. He was only secretly happy in his heart. I used to lead a group with bad hands, but now I finally have a good hand and a soft girl at that. Just looking at her is pleasing to the eye. In the game, the flesh armor was the standard equipment for a meat shield. Brando wanted to turn the most experienced mercenary leader, the Nightsong Tiger, into a meat shield, but the creatures summoned by cards could not use items outside of the rules. Although these mercenaries could pick up a long sword and shoot with a longbow, they could not enjoy the benefits of magic items. If they wanted to equip a piece of equipment, they could only use the method of attaching. For example, if Brando attached the Holy Sword card to the mercenaries of Lopez, it meant that he could designate one of the mercenaries to wield all the effects of the Holy Sword card. Of course, he still had to pay for it himself. On the other hand, the Roman and Amandina were not combat members, so of course they did not need this pair of flesh armor. Brando had no choice but to wear it himself. To be honest, he could not help but feel a little guilty. If he did this in the game, he would probably see a post on the forums by tomorrow morning. 2 or 3 things I know about the hairy man Brando, Captain Brando. At this time, the 2 mercenaries that were sent out to investigate the shrine came back from afar. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 165. In the temple of the elven goddess Shay, the sealed altar was opened again after nearly 2 centuries. Brando saw tall elves with cold expressions, long silver hair tied behind their heads, silver-pointed helmets, double-ended swords in their hands, and pure white silver-plated armor on their bodies. They walked down from the obsidian altar with large strides. Their faces were cold, and their long silver hair was tied behind their heads. They wore silver-pointed helmets that protected their faces, and they held double-ended swords in their hands. They were pure white chainmail armor that was plated with silver. The Silver Elves were known as the strongest heavy infantry in the continent. The Elven Guards. 20 Silver Elves appeared on the altar one after another. They all nodded at Brando and stood neatly on both sides of the altar. Finally, a faint shadow appeared in the center of the temple. It was like a spirit that was slowly taking shape. Clang! The mercenaries behind Brando unsheathed their swords. But Brando was not nervous. He could guess what was going on and nodded slightly. Under everyone's nervous gazes, the blurry figure gradually became clearer. Facial features gradually emerged from the white shadow. Finally, an adult elf wearing a silver robe, with silver hair and silver eyes, and even his skin was light silver in color, appeared in front of everyone. He raised his chin and looked at everyone with an indifferent gaze. He was taller than everyone in Brando's group. Even among the silver elves, he was considered tall and sturdy. The silver elf glanced at everyone with a stern gaze. Even the Nightsong tiger could not help but lower his head in fear. Even though it was just a blurry figure, everyone held their breaths as they felt the strength of the person in front of them. The first and only possibility they thought of was that this was one of the ancient kings of the silver elves. The silver elf thought for a moment and asked, "You are all humans?" Everyone, including Brando, nodded. "Who is he?" Amandina could not help but whisper to Brando's back. "I think he is the first king of the silver elves, Azoth. I have seen his face in the engravings before." Brando blurted out. The holographic image of the 11th king of the silver elves could be found on the forums. Brando was certain of it, but he could not say it out loud. Otherwise, he would be labeled as a fraud. But just as he finished speaking, the giant elf lowered his head and looked at Brando. "You know me." Brando could only nod. What else could he do? The ancient silver elves had all experienced the War of the Holy Saints. They came from the Age of Chaos, the Age of Chaos. One had to know that in that era, there were still golden bloodlines walking on the earth. The various races were all descendants of the silver bloodline, and there were countless powerful individuals. For someone like Medisa who had the strength of a gold-ranked warrior, it might seem inconceivable in the present day, but at that time there were plenty of them. The forum had estimated the levels of a series of powerhouses in that era. The conclusion was that the 4 holy saints were at least level 180 and above. The leaders of the dwarves, humans, and elves at that time were probably not lower than level 150. As for elemental activation, it was the basic requirement for a warrior. Those below gold were cannon fodder. All in all, it was a mythical era. Of course, these estimates were based on fragmentary information. There might be some errors, but Brando thought that even if there were, it would not be too far off. Just like this Azoth in front of him. He was just a shadow standing here. But the pressure he gave him almost made him unable to breathe. His experience was that of a level 130 warrior. He could not be compared to the Roman and Amandina. The silver elf king Azoth's soul pondered for a moment and said, "Thank you for the child Medisha. But on the other hand, you came here to ask for something, right?" Brando nodded again. Didn't Medisha say that it would be fine as long as she agreed? Why did this Azoth come out? Could it be that the little girl was lying? But Medisha had become his summoning card now. It seemed like he could not find her even if he wanted to denounce her. But Azoth paused for a moment and continued. "So what help do you want, former ally?" The elf king's voice was very low. It seemed that he was not used to the modern cruise language, so he spoke very slowly. But everyone understood the meaning of his words. They were stunned. So easy to talk to? But Brando understood that the problem was not that simple. But he still answered honestly. "I want to deal with the lizardmen bandits in the forest. On the one hand, I want to fulfill Medisha's wish. I hope to get your help. This is a battle between the living. How can the dead interfere?" Azoth asked. "Damn. Cunning old fox." Brando cursed in his heart but still answered. "No, this has something to do with you." "What does it have to do with?" Brando raised his head. For the first time he had the courage to look into Azoth's eyes. "Those lizardmen, I'm afraid, are related to the tree herders." "Tree herders?" Azoth asked in a low voice. After the War of the Holy Saints, the Darkness Dragon was imprisoned forever. The Myrnas were also driven to the northern tundra by our ancestor, the Flame King Gretel. Everyone said that no one saw them after that, but they have always existed. Brando spoke frankly. They scattered and integrated into the human world. They called themselves the Tree Herders, the Silver Sky Serpents, and secretly engaged in activities to subvert civilization. They were preparing to seek the Darkness Dragon's return. "Ah!" Amandina suddenly exclaimed. She looked at Brando in surprise. Of course she knew about the Myrnas, but she did not expect the Tree Herders to be the legendary Dark Ones. She also did not expect Brando to know about this. and he seemed to have known about it for a long time. But weren't these things very dangerous? If Brando knew, then there was no reason for the high-ranking nobles not to know. Why didn't they have the intention to completely expel these organizations? Of course, she did not think that Brando was lying. No one dared to lie in front of the Elven King. But if the Myrna still existed, then what about the Darkness Dragon? Was it really like what Brando said, that it was also welcoming the return of the Darkness Dragon? The previous Dark Age was the War of the Holy Saints that lasted for nearly 7 centuries. That was a chaotic time like hell. She did not dare to imagine that the world would return to that kind of chaos. Moreover, the Golden Bloodline that fought against the Darkness Dragon had disappeared, and the Silver Clan was declining day by day. How could they, the Bronze and Iron clans, save the world again? Amandina's face could not help but turn a little pale. After listening to Brando's words, Azadin raised his silver eyebrows. Those remnants of the darkness are still active? He sighed. Guilt is too soft-hearted. I warned him when I was still alive. It's a pity that this young man did not listen to me in the end. But perhaps it is because of this that he can be called a king. Brando did not speak, but Roman, the Nightsong Tiger, Amandina, and the others were shocked to the point that they could not speak. In the end, it was the younger of the Elementalist sisters who stuttered. Lord Azadin, you said that the Flame King Guilt is soft-hearted? Brando looked at them and knew why they were so surprised. The Flame King Guilt was known for his coldness and ruthlessness in history. This emperor who single-handedly established human civilization was the last of the Holy Saints, and was also one of the 4 Holy Saints. Most of the rumors about him were about how he cold-bloodedly established his own dynasty, and how he drove the Myrnas to the harsh north. But Brando knew that the real history of the players was not like this, but it was not convenient for him to say more. In order to prevent the topic from being diverted, he had to interrupt the question. The lizardmen are here to spy on the king's tomb. From Medisha's words, they must have been near the temple more than once. Your Majesty, you have been sleeping here for generations, so you must be aware of everything around you. Also then finally nodded. He glanced at the 2 little wild elves. Although he could tell that they were elves, the silver bloodline was too scattered back then, so he couldn't tell which bloodline these 2 little girls came from. So, Brando answered, and the young man's face quickly showed a confident smile. Azadin also showed a gentle smile for the first time, but it quickly disappeared and became cold again. Even though it is almost impossible for the creatures of darkness to break through Lady Martha's holy domain, the sacred oath of the past is still valid. In the path of fighting against the darkness, we will always stand together as allies of the humans. Thank you sincerely. Brando put his hand in front of his chest and bowed. He had learned how to deal with these high-level NPCs in the game. Then what should we do? Amandina finally mustered up the courage to interject at this time. She looked at Brando and saw encouragement in his eyes. My guards, I will lend them to you, Azadin answered. They were the most valiant warriors of the Silver Elves when they were alive, and after they died, they swore to fight against the darkness forever. They will go with you and help you clear out all the enemies in the darkness, but the altar is weakening day by day, and they cannot leave this area, nor can they project for too long. Finally, he paused for a moment. Treat Medisha well, she is a pitiful child. The Elven Emperor said softly. Amandina, Brando and Roman nodded in unison. Amandina quickly turned her head and whispered to Brando. He trusts us that much? She thought that there would at least be a test or something, but she did not expect Azadin to be so easygoing. Of course, Brando's expression was solemn as he whispered. You don't understand under what kind of circumstances the alliance between the humans and the races were signed in the era where they lived. The agreement that was called the Sacred Covenant almost did not involve any benefits, and was purely an agreement made for survival. In that era, the races that fought against the Dark Dragon's rule were as close as brothers, or else there was no need to continue the war. Are you talking about the War of the Holy Saints? Amandina asked softly. Brando nodded. But suddenly his heart skipped a beat, and he frowned and immediately turned his head in a certain direction. He immediately saw the Nightsong Tiger's eyes with the same expression. The mercenary leader did not say a word, and only whispered to him in his mind, Card resonance. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 166. The battle was long over, and Conrad and the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames were patrolling the battlefield. White smoke rose from the ashes, and there were corpses everywhere. The corpses of disciples in black robes, demons and mercenaries were still alive in this world not long ago. Now, after the blood in their bodies cooled down, their skin became something like glue, like a pile of molds. He took a few steps forward and flipped over the corpse of a mercenary in leather armor. The mercenary groaned, and the demon leader frowned and ended his life with a stab. Conrad raised his head and said impatiently, "No, the only son of Duke Lone is not here. That bastard Makarov. Since you know him so well, why did you come here to fight?" The Dark Bishop replied with a gloomy voice, "We lost a lot of men because of that tall bastard beside Makarov. How can you reap the rewards if you don't invest?" Conrad raised his head and smiled, licking his lips. He pulled out a blood-stained sword from the corpse and pointed at his subordinates. "Bring the rest of the captives here." A few trembling Grey Wolves mercenaries were quickly brought forward. In the previous battle, these people had fought like the most courageous warriors. But outside of the battle, the halo known as courage was taken away. They found that they had no power to resist, especially after seeing the bloody scene of their companions being swallowed alive by the demons. Only then did they realize that their strength was not enough to control fate. Once they understood this, the fear of the unknown gripped their hearts. One of them was the white-haired youth who Brendel was familiar with. He looked at his companions with disdain as they turned pale with fright. He stayed behind to cover Yura's escape, so it was expected that he would be captured. He raised his head and looked at the man called Conrad. They thought that he was just the leader of the Paper Cards mercenaries, their sworn enemy, but Brando was right. Not only were they in cahoots with the disciples of the Black Flames, they were also the lackeys of the tree herders. The guy called Conrad was about the same age as Brando. Whenever he thought of that fellow, his teeth would itch. Ever since he was young, other than his father, no one had dared to lecture him like that. This was simply a type of humiliation, and it made him gnash his teeth in anger. At that moment, Rady had already viewed the man in front of him as the same type of person as Brando. He looked at him with the most disdainful gaze in an attempt to infuriate him. "As long as he comes looking for trouble with me, I can humiliate him and show those useless fellows the courage of the Grey Wolves mercenaries." He had such a plan in his heart, but he didn't expect Conrad to be slightly startled when he saw the look in his eyes. Then he just smiled. He shifted his gaze and looked at the other mercenary. "Looking down on me?" Lady was furious. He struggled to rush over. However, with the dark mercenary pressing down on her shoulder, she couldn't move at all. Even if she wanted to curse, she couldn't because her mouth was tied with something. She could only let out muffled sounds. He saw Conrad walk to the mercenary on the far right and whisper something to him. The mercenary was stunned for a moment before he shook his head with difficulty. He originally thought that Conrad would at least interrogate him, but he didn't expect that the demon would just shake his head and drag his companion away. Lady couldn't see what was behind him, but from the miserable screams of the mercenary, he could imagine that it was definitely not a good place to be taken away. Then he heard a series of crashing sounds, as if the bones were being pulled out of the flesh and the organs were slipping out of the body. The miserable screams gradually lost their strength and turned into howls. Finally, it turned into a hoarse sound, followed by a low growl. The sound finally disappeared, but the remaining mercenaries couldn't help but shiver. Then, Conrad walked to the next mercenary and asked something. That mercenary was actually scared silly. He knelt on the ground and couldn't say a word. The young mercenary leader shook his head regretfully and stood up. He looked at the mercenary who was backing away and stabbed his sword into the mercenary's eye before kicking him away. He clapped his hands and ordered his subordinates to drag the corpse away. There were only 3 mercenaries left, including Lady. The white-haired youth saw that his 2 companions were scared out of their wits. It was as if they just remembered that they were only doing this for a living. Their previous glory, faith, and pride from the glorious achievements of the Grey Wolves mercenaries had all crumbled at that moment. They shivered and their faces were pale as they realized that they only wanted to live. Lady looked at his companions, who used to be incomparably proud of themselves in the face of life and death, but now they were acting like cowards. He couldn't help but curse them in his heart. However, he was also cursing Conrad. "Come and find me if you have the ability, you bastard." Reedy was unable to speak and could only speak from his heart. Reedy had never wanted to show off so much before. It was just death, right? He wanted to show his companions, who were completely controlled by fear, that there was nothing to be afraid of in death. The most humiliating thing was to submit to the enemy. However, Conrad didn't seem to hear him. He only took the mercenaries away one by one. It was as if he didn't want to get any information. He didn't even ask any questions. Even if the last mercenary knelt down and begged for mercy and swore that he wanted to join them and was willing to tell them everything he knew, he would only be dragged away. Soon only Lady was left. Conrad stopped in front of him. The white-haired youth didn't react at first and just pounced on him like a mad dog. However, his chest immediately suffered a heavy blow, and he was kicked back like a stray dog, rolling a few times. He then crawled up with his face covered in dirt. He was the only one left. After realizing this, his heart sank uncontrollably. Was there no one left to appreciate his bravery? Who was he trying to show it to? The enemy? But looking at Conrad's cold face and the dark bishop's expression, it was obvious that they wouldn't appreciate his bravery. A bone-piercing chill enveloped his body. Lady suddenly shivered. He thought of a problem. Was he going to die here without knowing why? Was he going to end up like those unsightly fellows? But how could he do that? He was Lady, the most outstanding youth in the mercenary group other than Eek. If he died here like those cold corpses, who would know that he was once a hero? No, he couldn't die like that. But there was no one left to record it. How he wished that there was someone hiding in the forest. Or someone else playing dead on the battlefield. Reedy subconsciously told himself that he wasn't afraid of death. Death was nothing. He just didn't want to die like those meaningless fellows. But he knew that was destined to be an extravagant hope. In front of the disciples of the Black Flames, other than the leader and Buga, no one else could hide in the forest. Thinking about that, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. He wavered between death and a more meaningful death, and his expression kept changing. Conrad stared coldly at the youth and did not say a single word. Then, he pulled out the dagger from the bishop's waist. Reedy shuddered as he finally realized that death was approaching. But he didn't expect Conrad to not say a word. He was a bastard, the descendant of the knight Marco, the descendant of the Erewhon nobles. He struggled, but he immediately felt the cold blade of the dagger against his neck. No, he didn't want to die. Lady's heart finally showed despair at the last moment. The will to struggle in his eyes naturally disappeared. None of this escaped the young leader's eyes. Conrad immediately withdrew his dagger and pulled down the white-haired youth's mask. He asked, "Do you want to die?" Lady opened his mouth and wanted to say a few harsh words, but he found that he was trembling and couldn't say a word. In the end, he could only silently nod. But he suddenly reacted and quickly shook his head. Then he felt his face heat up. It wasn't because he was weak, but because he was so frightened that he couldn't even hear what Conrad said. What a disgrace. Then let me ask you a question. Conrad straightened his body and looked down at the youth. The other group that came with you, how many people did they have in total and where did they go? Lady was stunned. If this demon wanted him to reveal the core information of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, he felt that he wouldn't be able to do so. But since Conrad mentioned that group of people, it meant that they had a common enemy. For a moment, the white-haired youth subconsciously closed the distance between them and faintly saw them as a group. He didn't think that he was surrendering and at most they were cooperating. That bastard actually dared to teach him a lesson. He gritted his teeth as he thought. They left towards the northeast before you attacked. There were a total of 15 people, and the leader was a young man about the same age as you. There were 2 women with him. He had 12 guards. Lady paused. They seemed to be at least silver ranked. I only knew this when I eavesdropped on your conversation with Buga. He didn't even need Conrad's reminder to sell out Brando in an orderly manner. If Brando was here, he would probably be so angry that he would laugh. He only punched Lady once and Conrad even kicked him like he was a dog. Lady seemed to have forgotten all about it. Conrad and the dark bishop beside him looked at each other. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 167. After Rady finished speaking, no one interrupted him. Under the night sky, a cool breeze swept across the battlefield, and the air was filled with the smell of blood. The demonic leader of the paper cards and the dark bishop stood quietly in the wind, as if they were digesting the information contained in Rady's words. Conrad raised his head and smiled faintly. He seemed to be praising the young man's cooperation, but he was always praising him, whether it was his death or his obedience. 12 silver-ranked guards. He repeated the white-haired young man's words. What do you think? 12? The dark bishop raised his head slightly. It seems possible. Even if it's a trap, it's a fact that the young man is not part of Makarov's main force. No, don't doubt it anymore. Being indecisive will only ruin things. Conrad waved his hand and interrupted him, turning back to the young man kneeling on the ground. Are you a noble from the kingdom of unyielding skies? Rady was stunned for a moment before he quickly nodded. Good, it seems like you are more valuable than those people. Conrad laughed like a demon. We don't need worthless people, so they were dealt with. However, you are different. You have a strong will and know what you need. The Grey Wolves mercenaries are done for, and a wise man submits to circumstances. Are you willing to work with us? The white-haired young man raised his head and was stunned for a moment. He did not understand what Conrad meant. Of course, he was also afraid that this demonic person would take a mile after taking an inch. Conrad had mentioned his identity before, and he was afraid that he would be implicated. However, Conrad's words were very clear. If he refused, he would end up like those useless fellows. Rady couldn't help but feel conflicted once more. He had already betrayed his conscience once. At that moment, he was like a businessman who was losing money. He had invested more money in the hopes of recouping his losses, but now he realized that the money he had invested was going to be wasted. He subconsciously did not want such a thing to happen. Conrad had given him a final straw to clutch at, and he only hesitated for a moment before he clenched his teeth and grabbed it. Even if he was going to die, it would be a matter for the future. The young mercenary leader smiled. All right, I'll lend you a person, no, a team of people. Now, lead them to chase after those 15 fellows. You don't have to kill them. Of course, if you can really do it, I will give you my position as guild leader. Conrad leaned down and patted Chan Xiaoyan's face. Don't worry, I will not lie to you. After all, I have to go to other places after completing this mission. However, Rady didn't hear him clearly. When the white-haired young man heard that he was only going to hunt down Brando, he couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. Originally, he was already prepared to cut his wrist, but of course it would be best if he didn't have to. At this moment he couldn't help but rejoicing that he had made the right choice. Not to mention the tempting conditions. Although the paper cards mercenaries were not as famous as the Grey Wolves mercenaries, they were still one of the top mercenary groups in the southern region. Rady couldn't help but feel excited when he thought about the possibility of becoming a commander. But when he raised his head, he was startled. This was because he saw the man dressed in black priest robes move to the side, revealing a figure shrouded in a long black cloak and shrouded in black mist. Rady was stunned for a moment, but he still recognized the person from the cloak's weapon. Scarlet. Oh, so she's called Scarlet? The dark priest laughed sinisterly. Then let's call her that for now. I don't have any talent for naming anyway. Once you complete this mission, she will be yours. The white-haired young man's Adam's apple bobbed, and his hands subconsciously tightened. He liked the red-haired girl, and that was a fact that everyone in the mercenary group knew. However, Scarlet only had feelings for Eek, and the others were just like siblings. Rady knew this, but he still had some extravagant hopes. He hoped that after Eek and Yura's wedding, he would have a chance. But he knew that the chances of that happening were slim. He took a deep breath. Although the current Scarlet looked a little different from the girl in the past, it didn't matter. He suddenly remembered Conrad's words. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were done for, but he knew that Yura was still alive. In fact, very few people knew that he liked Scarlet, and he was also spying on the blind girl. But that was a non-existent hypothesis, so he kept his ambitions to himself. However, at this moment, the beast hidden in his heart seemed to be stirring. Conrad saw Rady's expression and smiled faintly. He turned around and threw the dagger to the dark priest. It was a dagger used for sacrifices and it couldn't be used to kill people. As a member of the tree shepherds, he was well aware of this. The ritual was a sacred activity and part of the plan to welcome the dark dragon's return. The dark bishop glanced at the red-haired girl and quickly caught up with her. He bowed his head respectfully and praised in a gloomy voice. "You really are a master at playing with people's hearts." In fact, only he knew that this demon-like youth did not ask the mercenaries any questions from the start. Everything was a show for Rady to see. From the start, Conrad knew that the youth was weak. Human nature is weak. It is the nature of animals to seek benefits and avoid harm. "I've never toyed with anyone, I just give them more choices," the leader of the paper cards replied. "You know, compared to those who talk about honor and justice, I have a weakness, and that is that I never lie." The dark priest laughed softly. "But humans are cunning. They won't show their weak side. That's why interrogations are an art." Conrad smiled. "Actually, I was interested in his identity. I planted a chess piece in the kingdom of steady skies. Who knows when it will come in handy? But why did you agree to lend him your new pet?" "That girl's will hasn't disappeared yet. Let her see how bad her former companions can be. Only by seeing the dark side of human nature can she accept the information provided by the blood of God," the dark priest replied. "Good plan. What do you think, leader? Let's make some preparations and head to Hugel's place first." They actually headed northeast. They knew that the northeast was the lizardman's territory, so they thought in reverse and went in the opposite direction. If not for the fact that he can control people's hearts, he would have fooled me as well. To be honest, the dark priest shook his head. "I don't like dealing with that stinky lizard man." "I don't like it either." Conrad took off his blood-stained gloves and replied. The stars from the night before seemed to indicate the clear skies. Apart from the people involved, no one else knew about the cruel massacre in the forest. The only trace left behind was the faint black smoke behind Brando's group. The scorching sun was still shining on the forest in this area. After absorbing enough sunlight, the layers of treetops showed a breathtaking emerald green color. The green of life. Although this was a non-existent possibility, the mercenaries who had experienced the massacre last night could not help but suspect that the trees were so lush after absorbing the nutrients from the fresh blood. They whispered to each other, but their low voices did not escape the young man's sharp senses. "Feudal superstitions are really scary," Brando muttered as he looked at the black card in his hand. It was obviously made of silver, but it had a strange ink-black color. Melissa's smile was so warm, but it was a stark contrast. This was his only black card, but where would he find a card that could provide him with the dark element? If he could summon that girl as soon as possible, he would be able to do whatever he wanted for a long time. But as of now, this was still a matter that had no clue. He looked at the card in a daze and suddenly stopped what he was doing. Once again, he was sure that the throbbing in his heart last night was the card's resonance. According to the rules of the Planeswalker, this meant that there was another card from the same set of cards in his hand in this area, and there was a bridge between the cards. If he was not a Planeswalker last night, then the reaction would not be a card resonance, but a magic resonance reaction like the last time in the Golden Tree Canyon. But after he searched through all his cards, he found that the card that resonated with him was actually this card of fate. The Unicorn Knight that represented Medisha. The Eversong card set was created for him, but even Brando did not expect that a new rule would be added to the set in such a short time. It could be a new card of fate, or it could be an existence that resonated with Medisha's attributes. Whether it was an equipment, a creature, or a barrier, it meant that this thing had the potential to be sealed into the set. But it could not be a land card because Brando already knew that except for a few special cases, land cards would not resonate with any other cards. This resonance had happened 6 times since last night, and each time was closer than the last. The last time was more than an hour ago, and it was almost to their left. This discovery made Brando a little confused. Could it really be some kind of creature? Or could it be that someone was moving with that card? He looked up at the sun. After a night of trekking, it was already close to noon. After Iron rank and above or Constitution had reached 3 energy ranks, 1 or 2 nights of not sleeping would not have any effect. It was just that Roman and Amandina were a little more strained. Brando withdrew his gaze and looked at the situation of the 2 ladies. Fortunately, the wild elves were taking care of them, and they could barely keep up with the group. There was not much time. Because of the delay at the altar of order, they had to seize every minute and every second. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 168. Indeed, they did not have much time left. But that was only relative. The disciples of the Black Flames were active in the forest, which meant that they would be in danger at any time. But on the other hand, he knew that the disciples of the Black Flames were still looking for trouble with Buga and Makarov, and the only thing they had to face was the lizardman's lair, which was defenseless. Although a battle was unavoidable, he knew that the lizardmen were just a bunch of tree herders' pawns. It was written clearly in the guide that the whole situation was a trap. Some of the officials in Chablis had been bribed by the tree herders and were waiting for Makarov to jump into the trap. Of course, the sly fox's reputation was not in vain. Even in such a situation, he still managed to send Duke Loan's only son out safely. But he was going to be in big trouble this time. But all of this had nothing to do with Brando. The guide mentioned that the disciples of the Black Flames did not join forces with the Lizardmen, because the storyline had already ended. In other words, their only opponents were the Lizardmen that had yet to fully evolve. He only needed to look at the 20 elven heavy infantrymen behind him. Their bodies were covered in shining silver armor, and their faces were covered in winged silver helmets. Only a pair of pale silver eyes could be seen, and he felt incomparably confident. They were the Elven Guards, the Phoenix Guards. They were the backbone of the Sacred Alliance's land forces. Although the commander of the Elven Guards with a golden helmet had told him that their strength was rapidly depleting when they left the altar, Brando was not worried. The Lizardman's nest was only 2 days away from the altar, which was less than half of the Elven Guard's strength. Moreover, even if their strength was reduced by half, the Elven Guards were not weaker than level 30 elites. They could easily wipe out the Lizardmen. The only thing he was worried about was the disciples of the Black Flames. They were currently playing hide-and-seek with Buga. When they came back to their senses, Brando thought that he had already gotten the Philosopher's Slate and Medicia's necklace and escaped far away. He could consider leaving behind a pile of Lizardmen's corpses. Treasures, quest items, experience, none of them could be missing. This was especially true for hardcore players. Brando was even considering if he should properly devise a plan to use the resources he had on hand to kill the level 50 boss Oracle. Using a high-level NPC to kill a boss was the most exciting thing in the game. As for the leader of the Paper Cards mercenaries, Conrad, he would just be a side dish to the main course. Of course, in addition to these fantasies, Brando still had a headache. Most of the Silver Elves were silent and arrogant, and they followed behind the group from a distance. In fact, they only needed to make sure that no one could bypass them and attack Brendel from this distance, and that was enough. Although the humans were their allies, the Silver Elves thought highly of themselves and were unwilling to walk together with human mercenaries. This was a reasonable thing. Of course, this reasonable was only what they thought. Brando's mercenaries of Lopez were already filled with resentment. When had they ever been looked down upon like this? The Nightsong Tiger looked back at the Silver Elves and frowned. He knew how terrifying these people were, so he did not say much. He only said, "My lord, the Unicorn Knight is the core card of the Eversong card deck. Only one of the secondary cards in the deck can resonate with the core card." Yes, Brando interrupted the Nightsong Tiger in his mind. "You've said it 6 times already. If the main card is of silver quality, then the secondary cards must also be of silver quality, right? I can even recite it. Of course I'm concerned about this, but you also notice that the card is getting closer and closer to us. I think there's something strange going on here. Why don't we wait for the enemy to arrive?" The Nightsong Tiger smiled. How could he not know this? But his lord always seemed to be indifferent to these important matters. After all, the stronger the planeswalker, the stronger the summoned creatures would be. But Brando did not seem to listen to him. The Nightsong Tiger had repeatedly hinted that Brando should focus on the planeswalker's cultivation and card collection, but Brando still did not change his mind. Even though the Nightsong Tiger was experienced and knowledgeable, He still did not know what Brando's goal was. Could it be that he only wanted to become a king? In his opinion, this was meaningless, especially after coming into contact with the world of planeswalkers. Mortals were mortals after all. And the ultimate goal of a planeswalker was to explore the true meaning of this world and find a way to become a higher existence. Compared to this, was there really anything in the mortal world that was attractive to him? The Nightsong Tiger could not help but rub his unshaven chin. He could not understand Brando's thoughts. However, he did not expect that Brando's thoughts were even more easy to understand than he thought. This was because he was drooling over a pile of non-existent loot. The attractiveness of a boss to a player would always be there, especially when you knew that you had a chance to kill it and get equipment. However, just as the Nightsong Tiger was immersed in his thoughts, he suddenly felt a tap on his back. This was no small matter. Brando turned around and saw a shiny golden helmet and a pair of silver-gray eyes. It was the Elven Commander. Brendel recognized him at a glance and could not help but curse in his heart. "Brother, you don't make any noise when you walk." He patted his chest and let out a sigh of relief, then asked, "What's wrong?" However, the Elven Commander was a little wronged. Although the Phoenix Guards were known as the strongest heavy infantry in the continent, that was 7 centuries ago. But their strength lay in their combat skills and equipment, not in their stealth techniques. The reason why he was startled was purely because he had been distracted for too long. The Elven Commander did not feel guilty for scaring the leader of the group. Of course, if the Elven Commander took off his helmet, he would be so handsome that Brando would die of jealousy. However, the Elven Commander's face was expressionless. He coldly gestured and whispered, "There's a group of people escaping towards our direction." Escape? Brando was stunned for a moment before he noticed the Elven Commander's choice of words. Who would be escaping in this direction at this time? Logically speaking, Buga's group should be in the south. This was written clearly in the walkthrough, and he believed it without a doubt. Ever since he came to this world, history had never deviated from it. The Elven Commander glanced at him with his silver-gray eyes, as if he was dissatisfied with Brendel's question, but he still nodded. Brando knew that the Elven Commander would not joke with him. In fact, he had always doubted whether the Elven Commander would joke with him, or perhaps the word joke did not exist in their dictionary. But that was not important. He immediately raised his hand and signaled for the others to stop. Brando had already established his authority in this group, except for the Elven Commander. Once he raised his hand, the mercenaries immediately stopped. Amandina and the Roman, who were originally sleepy, suddenly woke up. Romaine raised her head and asked curiously, "What's wrong, Brando?" Brando gestured for her to be quiet. Soon he heard the rustling of footsteps through the bushes. The footsteps were messy, as if they were in a panic and did not know where to go. It was obvious that a group of people was escaping. Brando looked at the Elven Commander beside him and could not help but admire him. As expected of a high-level NPC, his alertness is not something a normal player can compare to. He had seen many players go out adventuring as if they were on a spring outing. It was simply unbearable to look at. Of course, the players were strong, and sometimes even if they were ambushed, the result would be written in the opposite direction. He tilted his head and listened carefully. Sure enough, he heard another sound from further away. It was the pursuers, and they had mounts. Brando's expression immediately became serious. There were only 2 forces that could use mounts in this area. One was the Lizardmen and their traditional dragon hunters, and the other was the disciples of the Black Flames and their demons. It was difficult for a warhorse to display its advantage in the forest, especially in a hilly forest like this. Brando had never seen anyone who was so reckless as to ride a warhorse in a hilly forest. He immediately ordered everyone to spread out and prepare for battle. But in the next moment, the panicked escapees entered his field of vision. There were 6 people in a row, half male and half female. They were all dressed in ragged clothes like refugees. Their bodies were covered with various wounds, but at least they did not lose their weapons. Not losing their weapons meant that they did not lose their fighting spirit. Under these conditions, it was enough to show that they were extremely outstanding mercenaries. Because of this, Brando had already recognized them from their attire. They were mercenaries from the Grey Wolves Mercenaries. No, these people were not just mercenaries from the Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Brando narrowed his eyes. These people were the Jedlon mercenaries, a rare group of heavy infantry in the Grey Wolves mercenaries. He had seen them before. But he immediately frowned. Something was not right. According to the strategy, the disciples of the Black Flames and the Grey Wolves mercenaries should not appear in this direction. He thought for a moment and thought that they might be mercenaries that got separated from Buga's group. Even though the possibility of them getting separated was small, but compared to the other possibility, Brando was more willing to believe that was the reason. When the mercenaries saw Brando's group, they were obviously shocked. Their faces were filled with despair. But in the next moment, one of them recognized Brando. In fact, Brando also recognized him. He was the young man who spoke a few words with Rady that afternoon. Of course, compared to the hot-tempered white-haired kid, he had a much better impression of this young man. He remembered what the other party's name was. Oh right. Sanford. Mr. Brando, please help us. When Sanford saw Brendel, it was as if he saw his savior. His entire body seemed to have been sucked out of him, and he knelt down and shouted anxiously as he raised his head. Even though Brendel did not like to meddle in other people's business, he was not someone who would not help others when they were in danger. Furthermore, he had the support of the Phoenix Guards, and it was the best time for him to take advantage of the situation. He knew that the Grey Wolves mercenaries were gone, and even though Makarov had treated them as cannon fodder, it did not change the fact that most of them were experienced warriors. They were mercenaries, and there was no other path for them to take. If that was the case, he could buy them over. The Jedlon mercenaries were one of the best mercenaries. Brendel nodded and ordered his mercenaries to protect these people. At the same time, he asked the question that he was most concerned about at the moment. What's the matter? Why are you here? We. But before Sanford could answer, his pursuers had already answered for him. Rustling sounds could be heard from the forest not far away. The leaves rustled and a few knights riding on wild boars rushed out from behind. Of course, those were not wild boars. Other than the wood elves, Brando was probably the only one who could recognize what the disciples of the Black Flames were riding. They were lesser demons, a type of demon that looked like a wild boar, but had brown and green spots all over their bodies. They had 4 pairs of fangs and 4 pairs of eyes. Lesser demons were one of the most important components of the demon cavalry. Being the mounts of the disciples of the Black Flames was a good choice. However, Brando took a deep breath when he saw the disciples of the Black Flames attire. Mr. Brando, be careful. They are a little strange. Sanford whispered a warning. Nonsense, of course they are strange. Brendel could not help but curse in his mind. How could it not be strange that these disciples of the Black Flame sect were all high-ranked disciples? These were the elite cavalry of the disciples of the Black Flames. Why would they chase after these 5 mercenaries who looked like beggars? No, wait. He suddenly pulled out his sword. Brando realized a problem. If the disciples of the Black Flames had really chased after them, Sanford and the others wouldn't have had the chance to get here. In other words, they were purposely chased here. But what is the meaning of this? Is this a show of force? He stared at the disciples of the Black Flames in front of him. He didn't dare to confirm whether these annoying bastards had their eyes on him or not, even though they didn't seem to have any interactions with each other. But at this time, the elven commander suddenly said, "There are still people in the forest." Brando immediately looked in that direction. He couldn't see anyone in the forest. He could only see layers upon layers of leaves, forming a mottled color in the forest. But in the next moment, he suddenly felt something in his heart. The Unicorn Knight's card seemed to have a life of its own in his hand as it pulsed once. Damn, it's the card's reaction again. So that's what happened. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 169. Judging from the distance of each response, the disciples of the Black Flame sect were indeed here to cause trouble for him. Brando shook his head and thought to himself, I was just about to look for you guys, but you guys came knocking on my door. This kind of selfless service, dedicated to the benefit of others, and willing to travel thousands of miles just to deliver equipment and EXP, was worthy of praise. So that's what's going on. Even though there was only silence, Brando could already feel the presence of the person on the other side of the forest. He could not help but slap his forehead with a helpless look. "Come out." Brando waved his hand in the direction of the forest. The forest was silent. The mercenaries were stunned and turned to look at him, and the silver elf commander behind him. The young man was slightly startled and said, "Huh? Not coming out?" He sneered and pointed his right index finger forward. OSS. Brando had never been a patient person. Since the other party insisted on playing hide and seek with him, he did not mind using violence to chase this ignorant fool out. The direction of the flow of the air became chaotic in an instant, as if the air was filled with countless turbulent vectors towards a single point. The air swirled and compressed, and then exploded, as a massive amount of energy surged forward. With Brando as the center, the trees on both sides of the forest fell and snapped one after another. After a loud bang, the energy of the wind bullet had cleared out a radial area in the forest. As the dust settled, a red-haired girl was revealed. The strong airflow had already torn the cloak draped over her body, revealing the red and black armor underneath. The girl was wearing a one-piece battle dress, with the skirt armor hanging just above her knees. Below it was a steel shin armor with long boots, red and black. It formed an absolute domain just right. She was in a combat stance, holding her halberd in front of her, as if she was able to stop the wind bullet from moving forward. From the obvious traces on the ground, the shockwave created by the airflow separated behind the red-haired girl, forming two trails that extended for more than 10 meters before gradually disappearing. Strong. That was the only thought in everyone's mind. The Ring of the Wind Empress had the destructive power of a peak black iron, and its impact was even stronger. If one wanted to block this attack head-on, they would need to have the strength of a lower silver. However, to be completely unscathed and not even move his body gold rank. The mercenaries present couldn't help but groan from the bottom of their hearts. The Nightsong Tiger rubbed his temples and wondered what was going on. Had they arrived at the age of chaos? Over the past few days, gold-ranked forces had appeared one after another, and all of them were so young. It would be understandable if this place was near the capital or a large city, but this was Erewhon's Randner region, the southernmost mountainous region. What is wrong with this world? After a moment of silence, the red-haired girl flicked her ponytail and looked up. A pair of golden red eyes stared unblinkingly at Brando. It was as if flames were burning within them, and they were filled with the will to fight. She straightened her body and swung her halberd backward. A flash of lightning flashed past, and the trees in the same direction immediately fell down with a ka-ka-ka sound. The girl smiled, revealing her white canine teeth. "Is that all you've got?" It was her. Brando sighed. How could he have forgotten about the existence of this boss in this forest? The Angel of Lightning, the Crimson Spirit Knight, Milfight. Brando looked at the girl who held the strange halberd with one hand and instantly recognized her identity. He couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. How could he have forgotten about this? The spear of lightning that countless mercenaries scrambled for back then. But perhaps he didn't expect that this Lady Knight had already taken over this place so early in the era when she was the king of this place. In fact, he had already guessed the answer, but before the answer was revealed, he didn't dare to be certain that he was right. The law of every night was immortality. The heart towards the light, but fell into the darkness. It was like a lament lingering in the air. The two spirit knights who were born in the same area resonated with each other from the very beginning. Brando couldn't help but flip open the card in his hand and look at it. He thought to himself, "Lady Martha, I named Evernight in the hopes that this set would be as invincible as the Silver Elves' Evernight Legion, and not this." But when he looked up, he was keenly aware that the red-haired girl didn't seem to be in the form of a spirit. But she was no different from Milfight. Regardless of the way she attacked or her appearance, they were all so similar. But Milfight was clearly an incomplete angel in history, and he was in the form of a spirit. But the red-haired girl in front of him was not in the form of a spirit, and from her aura, he could feel that she had received the complete blood of God. But what was going on? "Scarlet! Rady!" Suddenly, a voice called out from beside him. Brando turned around and saw that the one who called out was Sanford, the young man who was dragged back by the mercenaries of Lopez. He followed Sanford's gaze and saw that not far behind the red-haired girl, there was a white-haired young man cowering behind a bush. It was the young man who always acted arrogant in front of him, Rady. Damn, it's that pretentious prick again. Brando cursed in his heart. He thought that after teaching this guy a lesson last night, he would at least restrain himself a little. He didn't think that he would come again today. Wait, why is this guy with the disciples of the Black Flames? Brando narrowed his eyes and saw that there was indeed a low-grade demon beside the white-haired youth. So that's how it is. He couldn't help but sneer. You just joined your new master, and you can't wait to kill your former companions. You really are dutiful. Everyone was stunned. Rady, why you joined them? Sanford and the other Grey Wolves mercenaries didn't know how to react. They turned around and looked at Rady, unable to believe their ears. However, these people were not idiots after all. Thinking back to everything that had happened before, they understood everything. The more hot-tempered one's eyes turned red as they cursed. You traitor, to think that I treated you as a brother. Rady, you disappoint us. Sanford was stunned for a moment before he asked, Rady, what's going on? If looks could kill, Rady would have cut Brando into pieces a few times already. At that moment he even had the thought of swallowing Rady whole. He originally wanted to hide behind the scenes and let the disciples of the Black Flames kill his brothers or companions who knew him. That way no one would question him and he wouldn't have to worry about his conscience. Of course, that was if he still had a conscience. But he did not expect that his wishful thinking would be completely destroyed by Brendel's wind bullet before it could even take effect. He couldn't help but curse in his heart. He cursed Brando and the pointy-eared elf behind him for discovering him. Wait, pointy-eared elves? He was stunned for a moment. He saw the 20 or so fully armored elves behind Brando. How did they appear? Could it be that the leader? No, that cunning-maned wolf had other arrangements here? Rady looked around cautiously, afraid that it was a trap. But he quickly calmed down. With Scarlet here, he didn't need to be afraid of any ambush. The current Scarlet, or rather the God of Lightning's emissary Millfight, was a gold-ranked warrior. A mere 30 silver-ranked guards wouldn't be able to withstand a single blow. After he calmed down, he straightened his back and looked at the elven warriors with disdain. Elven heavy infantry, these fellows sure are creative. Don't they know that the most suitable classes for the weak and agile elves are rangers, archers, or hunters? He laughed coldly in his heart, but when he noticed the hateful and doubtful gazes of his former companions, he realized that he had to explain himself. How could he be called a traitor? Rady couldn't help but be glad that he had a backup plan. That was also the reason why he brought these people here. One reason was to let Brando and the rest take care of these weak elves, and the other reason was to find an excuse if he was exposed. He played with the ring on his finger and smiled hypocritically. No, everyone. I didn't join Commander Conrad. I only made an agreement with him to borrow his strength to deal with this fellow. He raised his finger and pointed at Brando. This fellow who caused all this trouble. Me? Brando pointed at himself and couldn't help but laugh. That's right, it's you. Rady looked at Brando, new and old grudges surging in his heart. His eyes reddened. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have ended up like this. Humph, that old bastard Makarov would rather use us as cannon fodder to distract the disciples of the Black Flames so that you could leave safely. It's just that he probably didn't expect things to end up like this, right? He couldn't help but laugh sinisterly. Mr. Brando, 12 silver-rank bodyguards, that's really amazing, I'm really scared. But what are you going to do this time? Do you still have the confidence to show off in front of my people? Where's the courage you had when you taught me a lesson last night? Fortunately, Brando wasn't angered to death by this narcissistic fellow. Just as he was about to open his mouth, he didn't expect the white-haired young man to wave his hand and interrupt him. Don't quibble, Commander Conrad has already told me everything. Otherwise, why would they assign me so many elites just to chase after you? I'm not an idiot, so you're the real Echo, right? What? I'm Eek? Brando was almost petrified. Right, your sister. P.S. Students, don't let your enthusiasm drop. I'm still burning with passion equals. Smiley face, to be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading.